The Raven's Basilisk. Chapter 7. Water treatment facility. Kicking his feet lazily against the side of the water tank that was his seat, Izime rubbed at his chest while he watched the feed from Cradle. Still working off some of the effects of last night's dreams as he tried to take it a bit easier. Quietly reminding himself that it wasn't like the bird was doing all the work, he had done the heavy lifting today. Snapping those tanks of toxin out had been the biggest haul in months and well worth the risk of sticking around now. The ensuing chaos should make it easier for Cradle to traverse the lower levels, and showing up before the action had really kicked off had ensured they'd optimized their haul. No concerns about the goons below. What was a bullet to Cradle but a slightly faster snack? Well, they were a bit like a flying turd according to the bird. The cheap copper jacket and soft lead was apparently a terrible tasting thing. Biggest haul in Voltum yet, Izime patted himself on the back while he watched the two heroes. His vision enhanced well enough to clearly see the folds in Stupid Purple's cape as long as there was nothing in the way. Here we go. What even was the use of her cape? Show maybe. Izime pondered the Thessian silver suit for a moment while Cradle got shot at. Dark Knight used his as an emergency glider, and Dark Scout preferred a collapsible variant, so he only appeared capeless. Was there some rule that demanded a cape if you were an X-type hero, or what? They each were horrible litterers with their grappling hooks, so maybe that was a part of it. Though Psyis didn't even use gadgets, only her pure alien abilities, so that didn't work either. Izime kept kicking around in his ponderings, waiting for the two to leave so he could get the one Dark Squire had used to get onto the roof. Psyis could fly, so what was it? Looks, personal preference, symbology? That suit too, silver and white, felt like a cop-out color scheme. Wasn't there some kind of color-changing fabric that could match her reactionary skin? Izime stopped his thoughts as he sent his own update to his much more mobile and metal-hungry friend who was down below removing the pumps. Izime felt his smile pushing at the edges of his gas mask as Cradle's excitement reached him through the bond. A screen displaying in his vision through either brain trickery or eye nanits showing Cradle's beak working at a shoddy welding job. We've got two heroes now. Money? Money? Yeah, it's money, Cradle. How much longer on those pumps? Fast! Fast! The view flicking quickly through a series of pipes to close together for Cradle to actually fly through. The bird probably changing to its clouded fur as it landed next to another pump. Beak and talon reappearing to quickly chipping the heat-treated steel as it removed another high-flow pump. The view quickly switching as Cradle's head turned upwards with a snap as if it had been distracted by something. Stupid Purple. Why? Yes, she is here. Why? Are you scanning topside? Pets. Below. Izime narrowed his eyes as he glanced back up and across the facility at the psychic. Cradle's words implied that it had been located somehow by the alien or was close to it. His bond relaying the constant pulses that were tickling at even its down. Izime catching a view of Dark Squire just as he did an excessively showy backflip off the roof, wasting another grapple that would likely never see the right hands. Not that he cared, Izime had bigger issues if Dark Squire's movements were in any relation to Cradle's accusation of pets. If it was just Dark Squire, then the guy was sadly way out of his league against Cradle. It would be a no contest as Cradle happily collected his dark orangs and other goodies. The real problem was the psychic that had somehow been alerted to their presence. There was no reason for her to play Depth Commander unless she suspected something, and Izime knew who the only unknown on the field was. Cradle was damned near flawless, and there was hardly a signal or creature here it wasn't aware of. Izime trusted his gut and trusted Cradle's abilities. If he said the psychic was petting it, then the gig was up. If Miss Psyis could track Cradle, that opened up an entire can of big fucking worms and threw it on his plans in Voltum, not to mention Centropolis. If she could actually somehow restrain his bond, that would mean in confrontation, possibly hostile, and there went every Christmas, not just this one. A fight was something he certainly didn't want with the Mindredder. Izime scooching back from the edge of the tank and standing preparing to take action. Pausing for half a second as he looked back across the way, just in time to see Stupid Purple striking a springing pose in his direction. Izime's heart stopping as two red eyes locked onto his own teals. Nope. Izime's eyes widened, a bit surprised at the snort of fear that had come out. He snapped out of the alien's line of sight, AMD immediately reappearing down below in the mix of the chaos. Fuck being in any clear line of sight of that absolute powerhouse, Izime breathed a bit easier even knowing the toxic fumes were coming. He had less than zero interest in getting super tackled so hard it had to be measured in AUs. The confines of the system of pipes and levels of scaffolding made a much safer place at the moment. At least here the pipes would hopefully catch a speeding bullet or flying psychic before they caught him. Izime letting out a low humming whistle to summon Cradle to his side. It was safer, but he'd rather be in top form, especially after seeing the biggest hitter here tonight line up on him. That meant as much awareness as possible, seeing as he wasn't nearly as physically capable. Watching through the pipes as sparks from ricochets followed his bond, the bullets themselves useless on the bird. Only an acceptable snack if they were cored with heavy rare metals like tungsten or depleted uranium. Raising his arm as Cradle slipped through the last few pipes, landing on his arm before snapping again. A level lower. Snapping again, and another level lower, snapping again to a scaffold a row of tanks over. Finally finding a decent starting point, he directed his bond to beginning feeding information through the connected line they had just cleared. No longer flushed with junk emotions and idle brain chatter, now filling with locations, distances, and schematics. Bring up all the pump locations. As well as villains and goons. Spots and dots. Damn straight, time to earn that cash. Work. Money. Eat. Izime mentally moved the mini-map that Cradle connected him to, dragging it with his mind out of his main field of vision. Taking stock of all the red dots that indicated the goons and the single skull that was roaming around further below. The map tilting to display the levels individually, the goons working their way down while Fearform was working his way up. Finally, a second red skull appearing as the map reached far enough to display the quiz top side. At least I can't throw up anymore. Izime shrugged, bending over to snag the compact high-flow pump that was laying on the scaffolding next to him while looking below. The thick billowing clouds of fear toxin were creating a dense haze that was slowly climbing its way upwards. Izime almost able to make out the incoherent enraged roars of Fearform as he discovered the damaged pumps one by one, condensing into a rusty taint as it rose into the chill November air, leaving streaks running down the primer-red tanks. Track stupid purple, if she moves to come down here, we are leaving. Izime directed his bond before giving Cradle a flick to send it off. A single blue shield appearing on the scan, the mapping fully enabled it was time for them to get to business. Jumping over the side of the scaffolding, giving a snap and disappearing in a shower of sparks as Cradle went scout further. Izime let the air pass him for a moment as he reappeared, falling mid-air, locking onto a nearby gangway of metal grating that would take him to another pump. Another snap saw him bracing and snapping, grabbing the edge of his coat so he didn't land on it. Landing with a thud, Izime let go of his coat, now sure that the frictionless material was well out of the way. Rolling to his feet, he started running down the gangway, constantly keeping a mental note of the closest dots on the map. His rapid breathing slowly fogging his mask, making it a bit difficult to see, fumbling a bit as added 2 more pumps to his pants pockets. The tiny things were powerful and would be perfect for reselling on the spaceship market. The little bastards could easily supply fuel, coolant, or whatever have you to pump. Their size and reliability certainly beat out their competitors on the market as well. It was easy money, but the risks were certainly climbing. Looking across the way and down another level, Izime saw a goon trying to steal some of his loot, reaching to pick up one of the pumps. A snap and a shove later, the goon was sent tumbling over the safety rail, Izime not bothered to be disturbed, but the sound it made when the man's body collided with the side of a filtration unit below. Grabbing the pump while he glanced down and watched the puddle of red grow bigger, he'd been there, it had sucked. Fucking ass, hands off our loot. Izime felt the smile he had vanish even as another pump found its way into his pants pocket. The dots were beginning to cluster and organize, much faster than he had originally planned for. The quiz's gang of students were obviously much better trained than your usual run-of-the-mill hench. There were plenty more to go, but Izime wasn't going to risk going into the real fight or any of the clusters of dots waiting to the side. Fearform had apparently found Dark Squire, and the two were settling their issues below. The red skull having not moved far from where it had dropped down, at least stupid purple had enough sense to stay topside and call for backup. Unfortunately, so had the quiz, and the villains had been faster. Izime checking the other red skull on his minimap, the one that wasn't the quiz topside or Fearform below. A bit of sweat dripping down his neck as he recalled his earlier plans on just how he would escape the synthroid-addicted wrestler Crusher. Izime really hoping he could snap his fingers faster than Crusher could snap his spine if it came down to it. Izime shook his head, clearing it of those silly thoughts about self-preservation, maybe that fear toxin was getting to him a little bit. What was death but another wasted trip for him? It hadn't worked the first time because of some science fucketry, the second time Cradle had saved him. What would it be like to finally just die? Though he'd been bamboozled twice now, so he wasn't very excited about his third time around, it was pretty hard to kill what he was after all. The yellow coat billowed out a bit as Izime strode forward, no longer bothering with processing things like fear. More attention being paid to the cluster of pumps Cradle had made for him to collect while he had been snagging the stragglers. That lack of attention costing Izime dearly on his next snap. Quickly making a note to have Cradle highlight all the heroes on the map. Izime spell dropping him directly behind Dark Squire, who was mid-recovery from being thrown up 3 levels by Fearform. No longer below throwing down with the fear-powered villain. The biggest tell being the massive dent in the side of the water tank above the two, the distance reached through Fearform's suit's assistance. Izime flowing with Dark Squire's expected response at having an unknown assailant pop up unexpectedly, he rolled with the hit. Stephen couldn't hear much besides his ears ringing, the only sign that something was there being the cascade of sparks. Twisting his core as he leapt back to his feet, Stephen only saw a yellow coat and the cylinder of a mask filter before he sent a kick at the henchman. Fully expecting to feel the contact of a solid midsection kick and the grunt of a goon flying. The satisfying sound of another goon going down didn't come, Dark Squire's eyes going wide as his kick slid uselessly and almost painfully off their midsection. Dark Squire's ankle twisting oddly as the force was misplaced. The only effect to his target was the kick spinning them to the side, delivering a bit of redirected momentum but no other force. Watching as that yellow-coated figure rolled with the kick and right off the side of the scaffold, disappearing in another shower of sparks before it had even fallen a full foot, those foggy lenses still locked onto Dark Squire's hidden glowing eyes. Izime grunted as he landed on his stomach, a few levels down and a bit further back where another pump had been earlier, taking the unexpected kick and letting Thorn's frictionless textiles redirect it. The main impact redirected, Izime had cheated good half of Newton's laws, but it had still spun him with all the force Dark Squire had put behind it. Taking the tumble and snapping back had been the safe bet. Now Izime was back a good way, irritated but safe and only a bit sore. The problem now was Dark Squire was basically right on top of the pumps he wanted. Hearing his bond, Izime recalled the thought he'd had earlier about marking all the heroes properly on the map. Between his human brainer previous abilities and Cradle's own advanced functions, they'd almost make a decent functional AI, almost. OE? Hurt? Just an OE Cradle. A bruised rib is all. Be good. No fight. No fight. Mark all heroes, please. I just ran into Dark Squire. Don't run. We fly. Izime sent the feeling of his pure gratitude back through the bond instead of bothering with cheap verbal thanks as 3 blue shield icons joined the map. Taking stock of their locations and the projected paths Cradle was displaying, Izime found his feet as he considered his bond's advice on fleeing. 3 heroes, 3 villains, and their accompanying goon squads were spread about the various levels of the water filtration facility. Things were getting a bit dicey, and considering the tanks of toxin, Izime was beginning to doubt if the remaining pumps were really worth it. Right up until he remembered where he wanted to sell them. Those generation ships didn't have dry docks anymore, their maintenance was of the highest priority to their inhabitants. The toxin was fun money, the pumps would be a good sale, but a better deed. Izime now stretching the kinks and knots out as he refocused on the prize. The cluster of pumps would be his, and then it was time for extract, no questions asked. First, who was where? Fearform was tangling with Dark Squire again, and the quiz was, fighting Dark Knight? That left the rage-buffed synthroid-fueled physical fighter against the psychic alien. Izime ground his teeth as he watched the marker for stupid purple flying. Izime quickly forming an idea that would keep Crusher tied up for a bit while he gathered the pumps he could. It would put Cradle in the spotlight for a moment, then he'd need to put Crusher down for a bit, but it was the safest option to keep the psychic away from the toxin. Cradle, give me the odds, stupid purple against Crusher. Purple, big win. Chances she does it flawless, not touching the cloud of fear gas. Crusher, big win. Okay, change of plans. Cradle, we are fixing their fuck up. No fight, no fight, no fear, we are not fighting, we are fixing problems. Izime felt a complicated mix of both expectation and resistance as Cradle seemed to be considering their mutual thoughts. Izime filling his end with considerations about the loot and the devastation that Miss Psyis could cause. Finally, a bit of reluctant acceptance leaking though the bond, Izime silently holding his own emotions as Cradle considered. A full-on yes not being spoken, but it was there all the same. Izime began to lay out the plot. Okay, here's the plan. Miss Psyis versus Crusher _. A purple hand clench as psychic forces snagged another piece of machinery out of the air. Psyis' white hair flowing widely while she tried to stop the physical attacks and break into the shielded mind of Crusher. Her more insidious powers of suggestion failing to breach the synthroids that were being supplied directly to his mind. Across from her stood the massive giant of an ex-wrestler, Crusher. The naturally built strongman stood in his dark red wrestler's outfit turned villainous attire. Spandex stretched across massive arms and a thick gut. The easily 9-foot body fueled not only by years of being a professional shoot and Greco-Roman wrestler, the hoses of neon green synthroids only pushed the man's strength and rage further. A potent mixture of synthetic steroids and a cocktail of hormones and drugs that were constantly pumped through the pack on the man's back. The already notorious wrestler stepping well into the ranks of Voltum's villains through the chemical aid. Ah! Crusher roared in irritation, watching as the control unit he had thrown was plucked out of the air, taking the other and slamming it into his head to clear it from the purple whore's sneaky tendrils. You can't get in my head, Eno. The metal doing no damage, simply adding to the pain and anger. The thick tar of wrath blocking out the thoughts of slowing, stopping, no longer feeling that growing moment of hesitation. Crusher balled the machine up between his fists, stomping forward now back into the fight fully, a simple plan forming to sneak past that purple whore's stupid shields. Taking a deep breath, Crush took the ball of metal and slammed it into a nearby cistern of water, the side bursting and sending a stream of brown water at the heroine. Taking the moment where she was too distracted by the halting the flow to charge forward, Crusher reared back, twisting his core for maximum power and pain. Delivering a heavy blow with a fist that was easily the size of the alien woman's entire midsection. Crusher smiled beneath his mask as he felt the alien's smaller body react, odd bones and spine curling against his before she was sent flying. Too bad her super-strengthened body could easily take the punishment. The strike probably hurting his hand more than her, but it still sent her flying back and through the control building topside. Crusher knew he didn't have to kill her to take her out of the fight, just physically restraining the alien was a win and would earn the synthroid's fear form had offered. Aha! Crusher felt more of the potent artificial chemicals flood his veins, amplifying every single thing he had just felt and saw as Miss Psyis had been tossed away. The absolute joy of her surprised look, that brief flash of pain when body met brick. That bit of wetness to her eyes told Crusher the alien had felt that one as well. The dust particles in the air settling like windswept ash casting a shadow as bits fell still inside. The scene would have been perfect if it hadn't been for that bird. The synthetically induced brain stopped its maniacal laughter quickly, blinking as it looked up. Crusher's mind tried to make sense of the shifting black feathers that were highlighted by the lighter clouds of dust sent into the darkness above Voltum. Wondering for a moment if his attempt to knock the psychic's influence from his mind had failed. Their dance mesmerizing him for a brief moment until he shook free of that as well. Wiping at the lenses set into the face mask of his roid pack, watching in confusion as the feathers seemed to still, poised and threatening. The answer as to its existence coming as a couple of those feathers came flying towards him, instinct forcing his arms up to protect his face. The blood those flying knives had drawn telling him it was real, not some psychically induced image or another synthroid-induced hallucination. Their blade slipping though too sharp, almost painlessly, but deep enough that if he'd been a smaller man that might have cost an arm. The wrestler's eyes going wide enraged at being caught so easily and harmed so deeply. The black knives however were quickly followed by a mass of bricks from his side, Crusher paying doubly the distraction. Psyis returning to the fight with a vengeance, the ball of mortar of rubble breaking more than a few bones as she'd hit back 5 times as hard. This time the one tumbling through the air was Crusher, finding the front end of one of the parked trucks that had hauled their missing toxin here. The Thessin took satisfaction in knowing that it had bought her a second to breath, air coming in weakly as her lungs demanded their oxygen back. Raising her hand, she continued the barrage with what was left. Crusher knew he was coughing up more than blood, the bitch had knocked the SYTH-roid out of his guts with that. Grabbing the hood to use as a shield against the further debris that was sure to be coming, Crusher turned. The deep dents and punctures as bits of rocks and more bricks connected told him it had been a bright idea. Taking the abuse as he tried to recover, the hoses connecting his roid pack filling with more of the potent drug. Gonna crush your pretty little skull. The threat was growled out, Crusher activating the synthroid vaporizers, not wanting to waste time with his own blood. The tubes built into his mouth flooding with the neon green fluid, which was immediately turned into a sickly green smoke. The maddening grin on his face widening as the fumes flooded his vision with each breath. It could enter his lungs, his eyes, he would devote every part of his body to the drug that could win this battle. His hands clenching unconsciously as he was already imagining tearing her purple arms off. Psyis drawing a deeper breath as the feeling of pure rage emanated from Crusher. A brick wall to her powers of influence, the man too engrossed, reveling in the visions in his mind. Her dismembered body, the bits that would be dripping from his hands. The visions assaulting her as she tried to pull her own mind back, instead desperately sending what remained of the room behind the smashed wall at her adversary. A bit of doubt creeping into the Thessian's mind, which she quickly washed away, such things dangerous for the mentally strengthened species. Things were getting nothing more than painful, things weren't getting dangerous, Psyis told herself. Sure, originally, she should have been tangling with the quiz, but lacked the protective gear was needed to dive into the clouds of toxin. Something Dark Squire hadn't spared the time to give her. The power spent maintaining a shield or clearing the air was now being dedicated to managing their newest arrival. Dark Knight having to leave Crusher in her hands as he went to rein in Dark Squire's enthusiastic charge. Psyis watched the last few bricks go flying by, slamming into and through the truck hood shield. The sound of metal tearing and the grunts that followed was a tiny satisfaction. Though she knew she was doing far less damage to the massive brute behind that hood than she hoped. Psyis stood shakily but confidently, her side still complaining every time she took a full breath. If it got too bad, she would just need to stop holding back and start breaking his bones. Even Crusher couldn't fight without his kneecaps. Psyis stood straight, trying to make the slight groan that escaped her sound at least half as combative as Crusher's blatant threats about her skull. Pulling her energies back from the man's mind completely, Psyis willed herself into the air, unwilling to let Crusher force her to walk back into this fight. Clearing the building, she saw the ex-wrestler, now supervillain, the deep exhales of green gas telling her they were both just getting warmed up. Two massive fists colliding together as the wrestler stood on all 4 of his legs ready to face her and completely oblivious to all else. All 4? Psyis froze, a bit more coherent that the villain overdosing on synthroids, though it didn't take him much longer to catch on. The heroine quickly recalling they'd not been the only ones who'd arrived and caused the villain's issues, though whatever had clued Crusher in had taken a bit longer. The two adversaries' eyes still both went wide, just not at the same moment. Psyis because she could clearly see the legs of somebody standing on their tiptoes behind the hulking chemical user. Crusher's eyes going wide as he heard a snarky voice behind him. The surprise clear on his face as someone had actually managed to get behind him while rolling on pure liquid synth. Thank God for advanced alien technology. Izime snarked before snapping his fingers together, finally satisfied enough to leave. The battery brick had completely drilled its hateful little gears into the synthetic supply unit on Crusher's back and locked its feet. Now it was just a waiting game and the problem would be solved. Izime sat down, relaxing on a roof a great distance away, far enough even his vision was useless. It was best to play his own cards a bit closer around the psychic, so the rest was up to Cradle, who had already been detected. Once again though Izime had been left to do the heavy work, it was something he'd need to remind the bird of. Psyis watched as the green fumes sputtered out, a cascade of sparks dropping from behind Crusher, whose roid pack was malfunctioning. The wrestler reaching behind him uselessly for something to grip onto. Green masked eyes giving the psychic in front of him a pleading look as their fight had been interrupted, as if she'd save him just to continue. The alien's muscles still tense, her eyes drifting to the side where a black raven sat on what remained of the truck as if waiting for something. Occasionally looking at her, sometimes bobbing its head or preening, but still there waiting. No, my synth, I can't. Crusher gurgled out through the feeling of his drug-fueled body slowly powering down, even feeling like the roids already in his veins were being siphoned away. Falling to his knee, he reached behind him, finally managing to get a grasp of his backpack unit, ripping it free. The little synth still in his system finally settling as the hoses were ripped free. With a weakened raw, Crusher tipped to his side, collapsing onto his arms as he threw the supply unit in front of him. Desperate to access whatever had been damaged, maybe even save a few vials of synthroid to stay in this fight. Instead of finding the massive damage he expected, crushed tanks, smashed panels, and leaking and severed lines, there was only a small brick. The device humming and gurgling angrily as a little bar on its side flashed a bit faster, the light slowly trying to fill the gauge. Crusher imagined the arms set into the pack were impossible to budge even if he'd been able to properly grip the tiny thing. Giving a quick glance at the psychic, who was just as confused as he was, Crusher glanced over at the only other creature he could accuse. There it was, its eye holding a spectrum of colors that rotated around and finally seemed to settle on board. The damned bird that Fearform and the Quiz had originally called him over for, the one their squads couldn't bring down. Giving a lazy flap of its wings as it tilted its head, preening a few feathers while it sat just watching. For all the fighting, shooting, and destruction, it looked like it was just waiting on a treat. WH. Atayo you? The wrestler groaned as his body began to shut down from the sudden lack of synth. The too natural raven's cry that came as a reply was downright insulting. Mocking him as it played pretend, insulting him just that bit further before going silent once more. Psyis' attention followed her enemies, her eyes on that nothing that simply looked like a raven. Never withdrawing them even as Crusher finally collapsed near lifeless. Her mind recalling those extra feet and this other nothing, their psychic forms conflicting with what she actually saw. Psyis' mind reeling at the void where her eyes clearly saw a figure, the entire thing confusing her own senses. Lowering herself slowly to the ground, Psyis gave a slight start when the raven moved, gliding over to the roid pack that Crusher had tossed. Watching warily as it hopped around for a moment, a brilliant blue light shooting out of its eye as it began to scan the device. Taking a careful step towards the bird, the raven's head snapping up towards her. Raising her hand, Psyis carefully took that step back, the dozen or so feathers that had just begun to angrily hum around the bird slowly setting back into its plumage. It wasn't here to make friends, not even willing to let her approach it, that was for sure. Money. Cradle tilted its head back, letting out its anger at what Izime was telling it to do. Izime demanding it hurry, not even letting Cradle scan the thing. Cradle knew it was a good bird already, it was a smart bird already, what it wasn't was a fat bird. Money made food and food made fat, and this thing was definitely worth money. It was obvious this thing was worth quite a bit too, even if it went against the rules. Cradle stomped angrily, clawing at the pack and scarring its surface with its tiny metal talons. Izime had already gotten them involved in fixing stupid Purple's mistake, taking this thing was their reward. It was Cradle's reward, it wanted the fat pack. Now Izime was telling him to only take the battery? There was so much food to be had, and it was. Cradle flicked its beak back down, snagging the battery brick with its talon and deactivating it, casting an ugly look towards the source of tonight's troubles and cawing hatefully. Stupid. Purple. Psyis actually felt her mind draw a blank for once as the bird seemed to address her directly, insulting her before flying away with a small block in its talons. A soft breath escaping as she watched that form disappear visually, the void never resolving in her mind's eye. What the fuck? The Raven's Basilisk. Chapter 8. Izime Noodles established 1967 . It had been more than a handful of hours since the incident at the water facility at Voltum's East End. Finally waking, Izime realized he had forgotten the same damn thing a second time. Sitting up while rubbing at his chest, Izime quickly shelled the repeating nightmare, adding another thing to the list of things he'd forgotten. First to set an alarm, Cradle waking him well after those 6 hours for a snack of RAM. Second was the light, which was still on. He'd forgotten to turn off the lights, wasting their battery brick, not a lot of it, but still they were a precious resource. Thankfully Cradle had returned with the one from Crusher's pack with a nearly full charge. Though that didn't matter nearly as much to Izime as his own empty stomach. The shakes he had woken with matched the grumbling protests from his gut as his body's battery was running truly empty. The beans he had eaten a day ago had been wasted, and before that it had been a meal of caloric cubes, which were not exactly sustaining, but more familiar than this world's food. It gave a bit of energy to burn, but as for nutrients a human really needed, well, they were called caloric for a reason. Not quite as similar to the cubes he'd been raised on during his first run at life. At least I still get an auditory warning. Izime raised a brow while looking at Cradle, who had escaped his stomach's rumble for the comparative silence of its nest. Glancing between Izime and his midsection repeatedly with a hint of worry reaching through their bond. The sensation of hunger and a few other unnecessary processes had been halted or replaced after completing his bond with Cradle. It probably had a bit to do with the parts that the bird had needed to replace to return him to a functioning state. That or those areas of the brain were being repurposed for the other added benefits such as info feeds. It was a bit of a return to familiarity for Izime honestly, though not good for the human body. The desire gone now, Izime's body only yelled at him when it was running on fumes and needed the fuel. Ignoring that led to shakes, those led to blackouts, which would eventually lead to death of course. The whole combo had led to an issue of actually managing his diet and weight. The pounds just falling away for a while until Izime had gotten the hang of balancing the UN felt hunger and fullness. Now it had somewhat stabled into spikes of binge eating. Though that in itself was a bit of an oxymoron, as binge eating wasn't a real solution either, just a bit healthier than starving completely. Food then, I tear stuff down then. Izime glanced at his watches, a bit surprised at how early it was still. Giving a more excited nod towards Cradle as he continued, hell, maybe a shower if we can find a nice shelter. It was a good idea, but it also required cash, something Izime had parted with in Centropolis, leaving all his physical money with Wesson. That left accessing his off-Earth accounts here on Earth, which was a bit complicated and of questionable legality. The Vidan Security Council didn't take kindly to off-worlders toppling planetary economies and monitored such things. There were a few banks he could launder through, but that would require moving some funds repeatedly. Izime got up, walking towards his box of potential solutions. The first was basic human tech, as there were some financial institutions in the know about such matters. Someone had to okay Blaine and Jame's spending and directing of governmental assets in orbit. That meant some clerk somewhere had at least seen a check signed in Clarksian and knew what sole credits were. Let alone all the more back-alley options that existed for the likes of less heroic financial powerhouses. Lux Winthor had to be cutting his own deals as well. Each of those routes left digitally accessible options that could be made untraceable simply by washing the credits through several accounts into actual money. Let's see. Izime dug around in box full of scraps, finally pulling out an older model smartphone, something with net access unlike his flip-open alarm. Izime deciding a nice cellular device would only tempt his bond into snacking on his mobile. This should still be salvageable. Taking the battery in hand, Izime held it out as Cradle flapped over and landed onto his arm. Carefully plucking the lithium battery up, it flew back to its nest on the shelf. A tendril in its mouth reaching out to check the connections as a few streams of nanite slipped between the layers to check integrity. The tiny robot slipping through the tightly woven and wrapped ribbons of metal to inspect the seals around the oxygen-reactive metal inside. Bad. Cradle tilted his head, shaking it a bit in disappointment, croaking over the battery in its mouth. Tilting its head as it expected Izime's usual complaints to start coming in, Cradle never quite getting why some snacks weren't snacks at all. Is it really? Izime crossed his arms, not quite trusting the metal-munching bird, knowing full well lithium ranked rather high on its menu. Cradle enjoying the apparently spicy alkali metal as it chewed away on it like gum, though really any rare elements were sought after by the bird. The time needed to create them counterproductive to just searching or occasionally stealing them, fabrication of such rare elements slated as an idle process to be accomplished in Cradle's downtime. Bad. Bad. Cradle gave the old silver rectangle a bit of a test charge through the connected tendril, smoke curling out from the edges. Cradle quickly snapped its beak closed and sheared a portion to let the battery vent before it could swell further. Black metal beak snapping several times as it quickly made the shredded silver disappear as the rest of the battery fell down. Bad, bad. Cradle cawed a little less proudly, fluttering down to try and fan away the fumes that could harm its oxygen-breathing family. The bird knew it could repair any damage to Izime's form, but it was better to preserve the delicate lungs in him. A few stomps left a coating of nanites that would stop any potential fires, the raven fluttering and wiggling its tail proudly. Well shit. Izime rubbed at the back of his head, giving a half-hearted chuckle at Cradle's tail wagging. The man knowing the greedy raven wasn't going to take well to his request, hence why he'd planned to do the transfer himself. I need to get onto our account. Waste money. Cradle turned one eye towards Izime accusingly, the raven's instincts railing against the idea of parting with any of their hoard. It quickly recalling where the stack of money they'd once had disappeared to. Wesson waste money. Izime frowned a bit, not accepting the blame for giving away the money, but it was something the two had discussed together. Though the raven had likely forgotten in its greed to keep its hoard. The relatively small bird having all the instincts of a fully grown dragon aside from the need to steal random princesses or bake cherry jubilee. Izime deciding to remind the raven on just why Wesson had been given the money by the two. Wesson has Shya, and you love Shya. Izime crossed his arms, doubling down on the familial emotions they held for the two as a reminder for his bond. He needs to waste that money more than we do. We can shelter hop. Shya deserves better. We want Shya to have better. We love Shya. Cradle hopped excitedly as it recalled exactly why Izime had gifted their physical funds away. As incredibly capable as the bird was in using its various senses and abilities were, sometimes it forgot such simple things and got all upset for no reason. Izime was right as usual. Cradle stopped hopping and returned to solving their earlier problem of money, physically creating their new card while pulling credits through the ether and running them through Earth-based accounts. Plucking a feather and carefully nibbling. Cutting and adding bits of metal as it forged them a meal ticket that connected to Izime's off-world bank account. A few thousand slipped in by the dollar through various banks around the world, cleaned and taxed accordingly. The credits their assets had existed as cycling through various channels and denominations to pool together into their own Earth-based debit card. Carefully crafting an account that would never be detected, ensuring the two remained unaccosted by the universe's scariest predators, financial agencies. Staying hidden was their mutual rule and natural instinct for safety. Not only was Cradle a high-value target being a creature born from the father hexagon. Something Izime had taught and warned the Raven about, the various risks and unique individuals that might pursue it. There was the question of Izime. Cradle had never questioned why even its own searches through records couldn't produce any history on Izime beyond some random street camera footage stored from years ago. The bird just going through the records and erasing the two without bothering to ask. Izime was a human and all humans had to come from Earth at some point in their lineage. But there was no lineage, no history, no data, there was just the face it knew since birth. That had led to more questions the curious Raven could have asked, but there was something Cradle felt more than curiosity when it came to Izime. Cradle was happy Izime had decided to make it exist at all, content in concluding the same things had happened to the other member in its unkindness. Sometimes things just existed, the two of them were proof enough of that. There were questions, but it wasn't like the Raven thought things were wrong, and Izime had never led it astray, ever. Its bond was right about some of the more complicated things, even right about stupid purple. He was right about good food, where to get money, where to trade things. Cradle stopped its idle process ponderings as it gave the card a final once-over before tilting its head to present a prize in its beak. This move should be all right too, nothing should go wrong because Izime knew what he was doing. Awesome, so what sounds good? Izime took the forged debit card from the bird, admiring the slick black and silvery magnetized strip. Pizza, burgers, something boxy we can take back. Noodles. Cradle nodded its head as it considered the small boxes that the human wanted to eat for dinner, thinking of a bigger box, full of something stringy like tasty cables. Thinking vertically, that's my bird. Izime nodded as he quickly pulled on his yellow jacket, carefully tucking his gas mask underneath before stopping and checking the fit. Giving a slight spin before hopelessly shaking his head. It was just too noticeable, the bulge making his coat puff out too far. Snagging his guitar case, he shoved the mask down alongside the worn acoustic, not caring as the metal rims around the eyes added a few new scratches on the back of the instrument. Nodding as the addition was much easier to hide now simply by wearing the guitar case as intended. Finally considering taking a pistol because this was Voltum after all, shrugging, Izime dug around inside of the box of junk. Snagging one of the more familiar 5.7mm standard Voltum issues he had lying in the box on the shelf. Voltum's street stompers liked to sling fast lead while the detectives favored revolvers. Each being something Izime could appreciate, though a bit laughable considering some of the things he'd seen those officers shooting at. Quickly checking that chamber was clear, he rummaged until he found at least 2 full mags that fit, tossing them into his cargo pocket. Dinner for breakfast in Voltum it is, Izime nodded to his companion before raising his arm offering a lift out of the sewers. You want to ride out or are you flying on your own? That's what I thought. Izime smiled as Cradle hopped onto his arm, a hologram projecting a view of the city from above. The view adjusting to a street angle of a few reference points around Voltum Cradle had selected for snapping to. Any close to a noodle joint and a shelter? Izime smiled as the view quickly danced back out, the map moving and swirling. Cradle finally refreshing its image according to the latest info from the net and the new parameters. Random back alley, okay. Izime smiled stiffly as he considered how many stories began with that particular backdrop. Preparing to snap out of the sewers and into Dark Knight's origin story, his hand stopped mid-air. Eyes glancing at the vest hanging off the side of the bed before turning back towards the gloomy mystery alley. It is Voltum after all. Go? Cradle asked as it watched Izime tugging at the vest he now had on under the hoodie, which was underneath the bright yellow raincoat, a bit confused as to why Izime hadn't just left. The Raven even more confused at the concept of wearing clothes and the reasoning behind the particular order of them. The entire concept was a bit weird sometimes, but it looked like now that Izime had finally redressed, it was time for human food. Why bother with the undressing last night at all, let alone stripping just to add another layer of down right now? Cradle certainly didn't think about molting every year, maybe in a century or two it would consider having another go at it, but the idea of wasting its precious metal feathers just to grow more sounded dumb. Yep, now we go. Izime smiled as he shouldered his guitar with its extra additions, raising his hand once again, Cradle deciding instead that his shoulder made a better perch this time. Giving the bird a half smirk, Izime snapped his fingers, sending the two of them to the pictured alley. Izime nodding in appreciation as Cradle transferred the information on the closest noodle joint to him. The information displaying through some mental means or by those nanits working some techno-wizardry. Give me a heads up, Cradle. Izime scratched lazily at the area where smooth beak became metallic black feather. An affirmative clack and slight push of the bird's weight leaving was the only response Izime needed to hear. If anything went down, he knew added markers would be displayed and Cradle's projected advice would be adjusted according to simulations the bird ran. A method they had developed for rougher escapes turned combat, now with the added benefit of hero icons. Rolling his neck, Izime felt a relieving pop as he started making his way out of the alley. Heavy-soled boots easily kicking away Voltum's littered debris as Izime walked out onto the street. Casually glancing around while he walked, watching both the people and the little red line pass by. Stopping as the line flashed, watching the cars pass by as the Volthumites passed on by or joined him in waiting. The line towards the noodle joint in his mind finally glowing steadily again, Izime started walking once more. Turning a final corner, Izime glanced around at the complicated junction that had led to the design of those narrow triangular shop fronts. Looking up at the sign across the street, reading the wooden signboard through the steam and exhaust that mixed together from the sewers and passing cars, teeming noodle. Izime nodded and blended into the crowd that was already crossing the street along the route in his mind, glad the line hadn't started blinking when the crowd reached the second sidewalk. Carefully pulling his coat close to not tempt any pickpockets, Izime crossed the street a third time, finally arriving only to push at the pool door, nearly slamming his face into the glass as it rattled. Fucking idiot. Izime rolled his eyes, stepping back to pull at the door. The sound of him hitting the door was apparently enough to draw the attention of the shop's single employee, who was looking at him a bit crossly. Not you, dude. Izime carefully waved away his words, not sure if the shop owner had heard him from outside, but not wanting to cause trouble already. Though Izime figured it was more because of his appearance, maybe he should have stopped to shower in a shelter first. He was pretty dirty, not really smelly or anything, just greasy from working and messing around in Voltum for 2 days straight. I know, I saw. It was funny, but you better be buying. The store owner nodded at the very roughly clad man that had just come in, gesturing towards the instrument on his back. I don't plan on bartering, not even if it's a noodle per note. Take debit? Izime held up the card in his hand, happy he at least was given a chance to possibly order. Entering the shop despite the warnings outside had been risk enough. Voltum wasn't exactly known for its kindness, and here Izime was looking worse than the goons he'd seen last night, covered in grime and likely smelling like a machine shop. Do. With a nod, the man gestured towards card reader on the counter, before pointing back towards the door. But yo dash. Eat outside, I got it. Let me get 3 of the beef and noodle bowls, chili with extra sauce. Izime smiled softly, nodding along without a bit of surprise. He wasn't even bothering with being bothered. He had read the sign outside before entering that stated plainly no homeless, no loitering. Instead, quickly stepping forward to order 3 sets of the pepper and beef lo mein, not wanting to waste the employee's time. Can I sit here and wait? If not, it's fine. Yeah, it's no problem. I shit, man, my bad. After the pleasant attitude and decent order size, the noodle chef had nearly forgotten why Izime was asking, hanging his head apologetically. I thought you'd know, smell, yell, and be all crazy and stuff. This is Voltum no, and we got some wackos, I tell ya. Glancing at the man, the employee hoped the more pleasant of their customers not take the reaction personally. I get it, man, and no offense taken, I know I'm rough looking. Izime waved away the apology. He had accepted this little role as soon as he had arrived. Staying outside a system that was going to ask far too many questions, just doing his own thing was far easier. Thank you though, I really do appreciate being indoors. Not been born, just dumped here in this fucked up wild world after the worst day ever. Literally the worst day ever, as there were few other days that could compare to the end of all sentient life in his old known universe. From then things had been really rough, now with Cradle and this whole life he was making. Here he was about to get some noodles, he had holeless tanks of toxin to sell, and was even going to eat at a table. Maybe there was something to this actually living thing that did pay off sometimes. Maybe someday he'd get to see Belle again and tell her all about it. The rest of those nerds would never believe it, but no, things weren't terrible at all. Izime smiled at the noodle chef, not minding the loud ring of the door as another customer entered, throwing the door open rudely. November 7th, 2018, the day Teeming's almost closed. The Thessian was already upset, Voltum having driven her up a wall. Well, not necessarily Voltum, but everything in it, well, 3 things in it. First, there was Stephen, then those 2 voids. She'd left Blaine Manor after Stephen had pushed too far, Psyis finding him awkwardly posing in the hall in a towel. Deciding spending her time was better spent flying around Voltum instead of giving Stephen more chances to show off in the hall after he'd showered. Patrolling had gotten dull, not because of inactivity, but simply because half the alleys in Voltum were dedicated to petty crimes not worth stopping. Homeless squabbles, small-time gangs, illegal gambling and other illicit sports, nothing on the level of Fearform or the mysterious voids. So, as she'd searched and actually discovered one of those burnt-out areas in her pulses, she'd stopped and landed immediately, already breathing heavily in excitement. She'd finally found some action. Now she was standing at some absurdly complicated intersection where the buildings had become something akin to cake slices. Across from her, inside of a tiny shop, she could finally see it. Psyis pulled her hood a bit lower, carefully keeping her hands in her pockets as she kept her red eyes locked on it. The thing was smiling and chatting idly with some human cooking noodles. Psyis' smile growing in confidence. The thing was completely unaware of her presence. She'd attempted a stealth of her own after studying its void last night with Crusher. She couldn't erase herself, but she could mirror the passing humans. It wasn't as clean at removing information, not good as the void, but it also kept it from detecting her in the same way. Not a blank or a thesin, she was just another random human, or at least she should be according to nearly any senses out there. She was copying everything from their pulse, their biological signatures, even mirroring that deafening human chatter. Still, that thing's abilities were impressive. Even this close she couldn't read that nothing. Simply resolving its shape better as she stalked it through her psychic mirror. That vague void slowly resolving through layers of clarity as Psyis wrapped her pulses around it. There was a gun in its waistband, something she could sense now even through the multiple layers of clothes. Its mind was still a void though, a space in her own psychic senses. Psyis letting her powers run over every inch as she tried to peel back that ability. Her powers so far ineffective it was impossible to know if it planned on causing harm. She could physically stop it from harming anyone, but she'd need to get closer. Psyis quickly crossed the street, not bothering with the lights as she simply dodged the cars. Ignoring the few horns as she kept her powers trained on its hands. They were moving towards his pants. She might be too late if he pulled now. No, Psyis reminded herself that she could just stop the bullet with her powers from here. Still, she breathed a sigh of relief when she closed enough distance to just jump the thing when it drew. Flinging the door open to watch as instead of pulling a gun he simply adjusted his guitar case higher on his shoulder. The one with the gas mask in it. Psyis reminded herself not to drop her guard. Chest still rising and falling quickly as her adrenaline surged, carefully walking around the thing as she approached the counter. Giving a quick glance at the shop owner as he spoke, Psyis taking stock of the situation from the cook's mind. Take a seat, the shop owner gestured towards the bar where Izime was sitting, still working on the first order. Not turning towards the grey hooded figure he could see in the grill's splash mirror. Let me get these noodles on and I'll take care of you next. Red eyes turning back, Psyis watched as the thing spared her half a glance, as if it had no clue she was probing at the edges of its shape. She almost sneered, carefully feeling around each layer of its nothing as she began to create a sense for feeling it. Her mind churning as she tried different methods of undetectable probing, each edging closer to a full-on telekinetic touch. The heroine holding back, waiting on the thing to give her the tiniest reason. Izime glanced over his shoulder at the person who had just entered, feeling like he was being watched. The slim figure's hood was drawn and obviously looking down, so it had just been his imagination. They were a bit cleaner than your usual Voltum native, but nothing too unusual. Stereotypical gloomy-looking Voltum dweller, and probably as easily pissed off as the rest of the damned city. Definitely as easily pissed off. The woman was already looking to chew the cook out, judging by her attitude. Not wanting to bother with any drama, Izime turned on the stool he had taken and leaned on the bar. Watching the shop owner instead, the 3 orders of noodles going into the water that was already boiling. The dry wheat noodles going limp quickly as the owner threw some strips of beef to sizzle in the wok. A few squirts of a dark thick chili sauce and a splash of oil left the cook wiping his hands from the steam as he prepared to take the angry lady's order. The same as my friend here. Psyis didn't bother with actually reading the menu or waiting for the cook to ask. Instead, she had been checking the shop owner's thoughts on it. The cook giving the 2 a bit of a look before quickly turning back to add the second order into the same batch, unaware of the intrusion. Psyis carefully taking the information she could while still keeping her guard up. It had just been assumed to be a rough-looking homeless man, one the cook had been intending to seat a bit further away before seeing to her. The face she could see and the one the owner was feeling sorry for both felt like an odd mask taped to an invisible thing in her mind. The owner's protective thoughts had convincing her to make a move sooner rather than later. Psyis stood, both her fists clenched, waiting for something. A provocation, begging, an attack, whatever it was, she was prepared. Who needed to read minds? She had been through hundreds of battles. What could this thing do that she hadn't seen before? Izime glanced out of the corner of his eye at the grey-hooded female that had just spoken and was now posing like she was going to fight. That voice was eerily familiar, but he couldn't really place it. Quickly going through his mental list of previous customers in this little line of business. Nope, no friends. Well, at least not any women, that was for sure. Maybe a drinking buddy or 2, but beyond that it was Cradle and Wesson, family. I've got good tastes. Izime turned back, passing over the obvious invitation for conversation, instead just shrugging at the cook. Choosing instead to call out to his bond, already preparing for a bit of trouble on his end. Cradle, we apparently have a new friend. Friendly friend. Or friend. You tell me, they're sitting right next to me. Coming. Now. Izime felt his muscles release that bit of tension as he heard Cradle confirm that it was on its way. No need to feel his own tension when his bond was already sympathizing, worried that anything could have slipped its detection. Izime did his best to ignore the feeling of eyes on him, made all the more obvious by the creaking to his side. He refused to look. Izime had done enough deal to develop a sense for when things were at risk of popping off. When things like this went down, it was best to remain inert, a noble gas that simply refused to react when the more volatile elements started popping off. The woman was waiting for him to make a move, had stormed in looking for a fight. That was a move he didn't plan to make and a chance he wasn't going to give. That's what Cradle was for. Instead, Izime planned to get his noodles and hopefully leave with his back up poised to strike just outside, though if it did come down to it, there were some actual spells he knew. Not much use against a real superhero, but some pissy Voltum native? He'd manage just finger www. Thoughts of the fight quickly disappearing as a low rumble came from his midsection and began to build. The growl not stopping and growing in volume until even the pissed-off woman seemed to lose a bit of her fire. Trying to hide his embarrassment as his stomach growled, Izime leaned his elbows on the counter, dropping his head in shame. Stubbornly ignoring the growl that was now trying to compete with the passing traffic in volume as he stared at the tiles on the floor. Psyis had been so focused on that moment, the one when the villain finally made a move, that the sudden noise had actually made her jump a bit. A bit uncertain now that it was actually here to rob the shop owner, and thoughts about her irritation disappearing in mutual embarrassment as she stood threateningly over the poor thing. It sounded hungry, really hungry. Half-starved if the over-full minute of stomach growling was any indication. The Thessian's shoulders and chest dropping a bit, all she could see of it were those ears that were as red as her own eyes. Sorry. Izime finally spoke as the grumble broke with a final gurgling, the heat from his face building between his arms. Fuck, that was embarrassing. Even the noodle chef, who'd been tense ever since he'd laid eyes on the woman in the hoodie, had given a pause. Glancing between the two, he offered some service on the house. Whatever was going on between the two, his grandmother would be ashamed if he'd let someone leave their family's noodle shop hungry. Besides, whoever these two were, it'd be best to stay on both their good sides. This was Voltum after all. Give me just a minute, I'll even top it off with some extra as an apology. The shop owner wasn't sure if the two were friends, but he certainly didn't want any trouble. Having seen enough already to not mess around or embarrass his ancestors. No charge. Apology for Psyis began to ask until the shop owner ducked his head to focus on the thing's order, the story in his mind filling her in soon enough. The shop owner was probably safer not letting it stay inside and eat, her tension returning now as her mind warned her of a second void approaching. I'll pay. Izime shook his head as he considered his second rule, no debts to nobodies. Reaching back to grab the card in his pocket, he could feel the tension rolling off the woman next to him. Card, like I said. Izime could feel the shaking in his hand stop as Cradle's voice came into his mind. That bit of tension leaving him as his bond finally appeared nearby, ready to act. Here. Here to my left. Cradle quickly landed on a window adjacent to the shop, tilting its head and zooming in for a better view. Cradle cocked its head as it turned to look at the person sitting in the noodle shop, its scans already deducing the problem. Izime had already decided the alien was stupid, so why worry? Stupid purple? Hurry, eat. Get in here. Now. Izime tried not to laugh out loud as Cradle's confused voice came back, the shake immediately returning as he was informed Miss Psyis was the pissed woman. He wasn't the least bit ashamed to admit the Thessian scared him. That was the main reason he'd done his best to keep her out of the toxin's way. No, the person who'd lined up to tackle him so hard he'd enter orbit somewhere around Sirius was standing next to him, just begging for an excuse. Cradle, don't make me say it again. No. Bird in shop bad. Bad Cradle. Bad bird. Cradle preened itself as it considered just what Izime was asking. There had been several ordeals already where it had sat and listened to very detailed reason on why it couldn't go in just any store. It wasn't like stupid purple was hurting Izime. Cradle stopped preening. The worry it had tossed aside, returning as it asked itself. Why was stupid purple in the exact same noodle shop as its nest program, and how had she evaded its detection? The father hexagon-powered BioRaven quickly began adjusting its own scanning methods, those it had considered perfect. Having a bit of difficulty trying to track a mental power outside of the usual spectrum it had to consider. Its eyes altering in color as it quite literally began to develop lenses, sensors, and readings that focused on stupid purple's Thessian energies. A rare species, as only one of them existed, so little of Cradle's time had been dedicated to detecting her powers. Simply using their clouds of nanits and bond to countering the oft-seen heroine had worked so far. Now Cradle was watching as fields of odd soft powers rolled from the Thessian's body and lapped like soft waves against Izime. Those energies carefully working through the threads of his clothes before fading just above his skin. The alien was preening Cradle's nest program with her powers. That was fine. Izime needed a good wait, what? Cradle cawed loudly, flapping its wings as it began to get upset in a protective emotional sense over its nest program being touched so familiarly. Stupid Purple was running those odd energies under Izime layers of clothing like Cradle did to its own feathers. She was nearly under his inner cloth down, clearly violating a member of their unkindness. That wasn't right. She wasn't his mate and certainly not close enough to even touch them, let alone preen Izime, the de facto leader of their two-bird unkindness. No pets. Stupid Purple. No pets. Cradle dove, flapping to gain speed as it crossed the intersection, not bothering with the commotion it might cause. Simply exploding into a cloud of particles that slipped in around the cracks in the door, the fast form hardly not even disturbing the rising steam outside. Intent on stopping the nosy poking alien who was touching Izime. Dropping his head slightly, the cook watched in the grille's mirror as the third child of trouble came into his shop. This final and even odder creature not bothering to ring the door as it came in with its shifting form and landed on the shoulder of his first guest. The cook considering for a second, mentioning the signs outside, the ones that would have avoided this entire problem in the first place. No homeless, no loitering, and right below it, no pets, if only he'd stuck to those rules. The Raven's Basilisk. Chapter 9. Thessian temper tantrum. That's a good Cradle. Izime smiled as a familiar weight returned to his shoulder, silently reforming and landing on his shoulder as quietly as an owl. The Raven now reflecting the same unease he had poured into the bond, though that emotion was twinging with an odd irritability Izime didn't exactly feel. He was certainly more nervous than angry at the alien, Izime hoping bringing Cradle in hadn't been the wrong move as the Raven's anger rose. There's the other one. Psyis hoped she sounded confident, finally finding some words to fill the air with. Her own powers wasted on flailing at that void, it avoided her mental grasp as it entered entirely. Finally taking an actual physical form on the larger thing's shoulder, Psyis recognized the two forms that she'd seen last night. The same black bird that had been there during her fight with Crusher, that same yellow that she had seen across the field of tanks. Both of them had decided to get involved and now she wanted answers. Psyis running red eyes over the bird as she reached out with her powers, cold eyes probing her own in return. The little psychic shield she had prepared to stop a firearm doing nothing against the electronic sweep that would have made Dark Squire blush. Psyis sneered a bit and sent another pulse at the man instead, wanting to see if she got the same electronic response. The words that came out of the bird's mouth at her action stopped her powers cold. Stupid Purple. Cradle swung its head, glaring at the alien with its other eye, hoping from Izime's shoulder to the counter. Posturing, clacking, and hopping in, warning it tried to ward off the unwanted attention, the alien obviously no suitor. If she wanted attention she'd get it, Izime obviously not wanting to engage with the pushy alien who couldn't take a no. Raising its wings, Cradle leapt down, wanting to threaten the larger purple alien directly in Izime's stead. Clacking its beak like a machine gun to scan her back, it was returning little beyond basic biometrics and the fluctuation in her own probing of Izime. Still, Cradle cycled the scans as fast as it could, returning the same rudeness she was giving. The two doing little more than silently screaming at each other, but Cradle knew it was louder. Raising its head to give a mic it, Cradle was a bit surprised that it wasn't the Thessian who'd moved towards it. Instead, rolling a bit and pulling gently with both talon and beak at the yellow sleeves that quickly plucked it from the counter. Ijit Godfusion, damn it, Cradle. Izime quickly swatted at Cradle, purely out of survival instinct as the bird addressed the woman directly by their own name for her, don't call her that to her fucking face. Cradle dodging as it kept clacking at the Thessian, wanting to keep their contest going, anything to keep its grubby little powers off of Izime really. It'd even part with some of its hoard if the annoying woman would just leave so its bond could eat. Psyis blinked for a moment as her mind started back up, needing to ask a question after hearing the man in yellow's words. Recalling how she'd been similarly addressed last night and now hearing that it was possible a regular thing. It might be a bit of a personal thing, but she liked to keep track of all the little names that had sprung up around her, so it was best to clarify this one. I'm sorry. Psyis turned to regard the two of them fully, taking a slow breath as she tried to calm her nerves. She'd need to add it to the list, so it was best for it to come clean. Stupid what now? There had been a few names, all the way from Centropolis alienating alien to the Mind's Angel, which was a bit embarrassing. A few villains had some clever zingers, others just settled for blue or something similar like Crusher had. However, the look the bird had given her left no mistake, she had just been called Stupid Purple. Being insulted by a bird was new. Sure, it was a weird odd-looking metal digital mechanized bird, but a bird had in fact just called her stupid and purple. A whole new creature, a whole new insult, the Thessian not sure if she was impressed. The particular level of irritation she was now feeling was new as well, red eyes blinking blankly as the thing's apology. Psyis quickly deciding the answer was yes, she was impressed at its sheer goddamned audacity. I'd like to apologize for my friend's racist and or speciesist tendencies, which it certainly didn't get from me. Izime tried to keep his own cool as he felt the piss radiating off the Centropolis celebrity, attempting a feeble apology at the rude nickname. Looking over at Cradle, he tried to correct the wrong assumptions he'd given the Raven. Cradle Thessians aren't just purple, they have a blue mottling that darkens with their sleep cycle or threat response. That's Miss Psyis. No purple? Cradle tilted its head at Izime, want to make sure it was insulting the alien the right way. Blackhead turning between the two as its brain worked away at the problem. It knew her name was Miss Psyis, it wasn't going to just call her that though, as it had already decided on a name for the alien. No purple. Izime confirmed, giving Cradle a little scratch before proudly smiling at Miss Psyis, only to nearly falling off his stool when Cradle proved it hadn't learned a thing. The bird cawing out loudly enough that it was painfully obvious its partner hadn't been the intended recipient of its words. Just stupid. Cradle nodded before turning to see if the alien was smart enough to realize it was still being insulted. She was. Cradle cawing again as Miss Psyis sent another wave of that soft power at Izime. A few of its own feathers rattling in warning as the female ran the risk of ruining its bond's meal. Something Izime desperately needed judging by Cradle's own monitoring. Psyis was ready to make her move to defend herself when the one in the yellow coat reached out. She wasn't sure how the mechanical bird's feathers had floated away, Psyis simply knew if they came at her she probably couldn't stop them easily. Watching as two very human-looking hands carefully reached out and avoiding the edges and palmed the bird into his lap. Those blades rotating and floating harmlessly against his palms as he tried to coax the bird to calm. Okay, no. Bad Cradle. Izime pulled the raven back, carefully cupping the loose feathered blades and putting the raven back in the spot that had earned its name. Pulling the bird in close, he started gently rocking the dangerous bird against his chest. Come on now, we don't start fights. No pets. Cradle tried to flap in protest as another ripple of psychic energy came their direction, instead finding its wings tucked back into the comfy confines of Izime's arms. Pouring its irritation through to its bond instead as it looked up demanding an explanation on why he'd let himself be molested so. She pets. She pets. She pets. She pets. She pets. She pets. SSHHH. Finally resorting to clacking back its own sensor-laden blast as Izime was just going to unknowingly letting himself be preened. The psychic's powers feeling much more personal than the electronics Cradle could use. Finally souring enough to bury its beak in protest as its bond just didn't understand. Quietly if irritably allowing Izime to rock it as Cradle knew it wasn't going to be allowed to intervene. Hey, please stop. Izime pulled his coat between the two, at least wanting to stop Cradle's visual instincts if it changed its mind. Finally turning to look at the voice he had recognized from TV broadcasts where she was detailing how many she'd saved or the depths of villainy the villain had tried to commit. Both of you. What are you? Psyis asked, watching as the man-looking thing was trying to calm the raven as if it was a real bird. Not even bothering to apologize for the second more focused sweep that had just blasted her in the face. Admonishing both of them as if they were both children who had started fussing for no reason. Hungry. Izime snarked on instinct, smiling as the stupid joke crossed his mind before shaking his head. The alien obviously wasn't going to share in his humor. Giving an actual answer with the utmost confidence, I'm a human. The alien watched the human expression, that very human smile falter under her gaze. The lines that were etched onto a face that couldn't be much older than her loosening as his face fell a bit. Did he really think some tired-ass joke was going to get him out of this? Psyis growing a bit more irritated as this thing was obviously not treating her like the threat she deserved to be seen as. No, you're not. Psyis shook her head in denial. She knew humans, she could read humans, feel them with her powers. This thing was a blank, a gap in everything she recognized. Yes. I am. Izime rolled his eyes a bit insulted, sure there was some give and take there. To those that mattered, though he was human enough, even aside from the few mushed bits that had been replaced or upgraded, even got the proper fear of mind-reading aliens to prove it. I can't read your mind. Psyis pointed, accusing the man with the most damning evidence she had. If it was a human apparently wasn't half the psychic the entire world thought she was, that same belief working its way into her voice as she refuted him. And let's both be thankful for that. Izime gave a nod past the hand towards the purple and blue mottled chin that was poking out from under the hood. No one wants to hear this constant chatter, trust me. Be glad I'm polite enough to shut that door. Loud. A croak came from behind the yellow coat, the raven unable to stop itself from contributing. The bond was amazing, but it had taken them a bit to learn how to manage their shared communications. The times Cradle had been caught snacking and Izime known because of his own satisfying hunger, or the times Cradle been startled because of Izime's nightmares. Shush you. Izime poked at the one that was actually keeping his mental connections occupied, teal eyes gently gazing down at the two irritated lenses that looked back up at him. The bond acting like two landlines connecting, confident in their ability to keep that connection from getting tapped. The psychic was unable to join and force a party call. The bond was surprisingly handy at times, but it wasn't foolproof. Izime still wanted to be safe and stuck to the no psychics rule, had stuck to it until 2 days ago. Now look where that had gotten him. Izime already knew this wasn't going to end with just a simply talk in a noodle shop. Why can't I read your mind or sense you? Psyis narrowed her eyes as she tried to reason out just how this man could actually be a man and resist her. Even Zexians like Radiation Man had to struggle to keep her at bay. Here this thing was stopping her as casually as he was sitting there, just effortlessly halting her best attempts. Izime leaned back a bit at the idea that the woman was just allowed to know him, or anyone just because she felt like it. Looking at the woman in her grey hoodie, now feeling a bit irate himself. That was a place he'd been, and it wasn't right. That wasn't what heroes did. Miss Psyis obviously felt like she could just invade his privacy because she felt like it. You need a reason, a damned good one, to begin the process of accusing people of thought crimes or even looking for them. One he'd had that certainly didn't exist here. Miss Psyis, I don't want to sound rude, but what right do you have to invite yourself into my mind of all places, or to track me, or even legally search me? Izime shook his head, trying to at least be professional with the hero that stood solidly on side of his grey code. I'm going to have to agree with Cradle on this. If you are doing any of these, stop. I'm absolutely not involving myself with a psychic, let alone you, just because you're out looking for a fight. Aside from last night? Psyis pulled her hood back, her white hair spilling out as she wanted him to look at the person he had interfered with the night before. Psyis unsure if she'd wanted him to feel guilty for interrupting her fight or stopping the villains, just knowing he'd need to see her face to understand just how upset she was about the whole thing in general. Fine, she was looking for a fight, but if it hadn't done things, she'd never known to look for it at all. So, this was its fault. That was business. Izime tried to ignore the accusatory glare that was coming, those red eyes, lips pulling tight as the alien knew she had a point. He had interfered, which was just another broken rule. It wasn't like he'd been asking for this, but there was a reason he'd had those rules in the first place. Izime looking past her a ways, a bit uncomfortable already being hit with such facts, let alone directly looking at her while being so accused. Not that she was ugly, it was just a bit embarrassing to be caught so easily. The oddly off-human bone structure gave her a very elegant face, maybe a bit gaunt, but hey, so was he. It was just a natural level of uncomfortable that came from dealing with a literal mind reader that had caught you with your hand in the cookie jar. So what? He hadn't wanted people to get hurt, and that inherently meant she couldn't get hurt those couple times, that was all. He'd solved 2 problems at most for Voltum, there was no need to take it so personally. Still, judging by her reaction, his arrival, just as he figured, hadn't been taken well. Izime regretting ever so slightly not sticking to his rules. Noodles, please. Izime sent a silent prayer skyward that the cook hurried. Though it was obvious from the man shaking hands, he was working as fast as his own fear allowed. Understandable, of course, seeing as the actual from Centropolis Miss Psyis was here and seemed to be pissed at one of his customers. Izime could sympathize with the insurance claim the man was likely imagining at this moment. So, you'll do business with a round psychic, eat with one around. Psyis tilted her head, asking for an explanation and a name. Giving a look towards the same cook that had the man's attention, but not have a chat with one? Make it make sense, mister? The silence stretched on while the smell of chilies and beef filled the room. The chair under the psychic creaking as the answers obviously weren't coming. I'm obviously Miss Psyis, and you are? Psyis felt her brows nearly touching as this absolute nothing just glanced at her and went back to waiting without a word, stonewalling every attempt she made to be at least conversational. Even Stella the Devourer had a bit of God's be damned respect and faced her directly. Yet here, mister. Maybe she should just resort to physically strangling the damned thing. Psyis struggled to manage her indignation at being ignored. Psychic abilities and pride be damned. Psyis cursed in her mind, Thessian emotions translated to physical strength, and this stain was about to find out just how upset she could get. Her mood snapping for a second, a thin leg kicking at the stool under her, imagining the metal bar as the man's head. A sudden snap and crackle coming from the side of the counter that didn't have the wok. Don't do the whole naming thing. Izime rolled his eyes as the woman actually stomped her foot, the rest under her stool creaking in protest before it sheared away. Izime eyeing the cracked tiles that formed under the chair warily, and my business wasn't with you, but you are welcome for the crusher disposal. I am welcome? Psyis actually felt her brain lock up at the very idea, gesturing at the man's wild get-up accusingly. He had disposed of Crusher for her, did he expect her to fall at his feet? Well, thank you, Mr. Nobody. Turning as she tried to keep her cool, breathing heavily as she looked at the most irritating person she'd met today. This jerk was 1,000 times worse than Stephen when it came to ego. Okay, she'd made a few assumptions, but what else could she do when both then and especially now the idiot refused to spare her a single minute? Stupid brown hair and stupid coat and that absolutely idiotic notion that she'd needed any help at all. Its pet had insulted her, he'd had refused to be any sort of human or even acknowledge her. Couldn't even manage something as simple as talking while being a shred of decent and still had the audacity to claim he'd helped her. Mouth opening and closing, just as undecided as the Thessian's colours as she rotated through her 2 shades, absolutely enraged. Thoughts of Dark Knight's warnings forgotten and her own Thessian instincts buried under the desire to kick this prick's ego down a notch. She knew what he was under that void, an asshole. Noodles? A quiet and timid voice came from the other side of the counter, the owner counting the floor tiles between quick glances at the two, holding out a bag. The shop owner careful to not glance at the one having a color of a fit, taking issue with homeless man. He wasn't sure what it was, but it certainly sounded like they both needed to leave his shop. Peacefully, mind you, especially after hearing the woman say the man had brought down Crusher on her behalf and obviously not appreciated it. The shop owner having seen a few turf wars, she was upset as if he'd gotten in her way. The noodle chef wanting no part of anything that involved two people that could bring down the Voltum villain, let alone some superwoman who felt like she'd been overstepped and had come to settle the score. He'd heard that bit about her powers and seen that damned buzzsaw of a buzzard and wanted them both out as quickly and quietly as possible. Thank you, Izime carefully tucked Cradle under his arm and went to the register. Waving the cook over, he tapped his card quickly and turned to leave. Casually giving the Centropolis powerhouse the peace sign, Izime turned towards the exit. Unaware of just how far he had pushed the psychic already. Sorry, you're staying. Psyis arched her eyebrow, raising a hand, sealing even the air out with a mental force field that even Radiation Man would need a tan to break. Turning the lock for extra dramatic effect, Psyis flashed a small smirk. Finishing the locking motion by making the same peace sign it had given her. The sharp snort that followed wasn't the exact response she expected, the man turning back his look saying he'd tired of her. Izime turned to actually give the alien his full attention, tugging his guitar up a bit further with his free hand. Careful to reach upwards and not lift the bottom of the soft case, not wanting to look like he was reaching. Still no thought of surrendering to the psychic crossed his mind, he certainly didn't plan on giving her a valid excuse. Refusing to relinquish dinner in the face of the hero, he simply gestured towards a sign, though it was backwards on the door. I really can't, it's not allowed unless you're taking over this shop. Izime rolled his eyes, a bit depressed. He was using his homeless status in this way. Still, talk fu was one of the best tactics out there when it was your livelihood at stake, and you couldn't really afford to fight. Psyis tilted her head trying to read the sign, though the /Selamoon wasn't making a whole lot of sense to her. Glancing between the shop owner whose mind was blanked out with fear and the man she couldn't read. There was no shortcut to an answer available, white mohawk swishing as she looked back towards the window trying to spell it out properly. NNNU it's FF fine. The shop owner stuttered, quickly realizing what the man was indicating. The stenciled no homeless, no loitering was still plainly there in bright red regardless of how fiercely he tried to wave them away. Psyis stopping her efforts as she read the reason from the cook's mind, along with the twinge of happiness that the homeless man was still leaving regardless of the owner's offer to let him stay. The hero biting her lip as she'd been used to kick a homeless man out, sure it was more than just some average person but still. It wasn't a comfortable feeling to be the convenient reason someone was kicked out into the cold. Psyis' anger chilling just a bit as she began to replay just who had done what in the store. The man was obviously hungry and had only come to eat and she'd. Chill man, I'm not fighting anyone. Izime patted the air, looking at the owner while the psychic still struggled to read backwards. And Cradle needs to work off whatever happened to it, so I'm not planning on staying anyway. Psyis looked back out the window as she tried to avoid her self-reflection. He was right, she had come in looking for a fight, even excited about finding it and having that chance to get some action. Still, he was also wrong, she hadn't needed his help, and what's more, the damned man's attitude was unacceptable. Red eyes avoided their own reflections as Psyis refused to relinquish all of her anger. Finally turning towards the psychic who was still fuming, though not quite as cross as she had been before. Though Izime figured that excuse would only last as long as she felt like it should, which would be maybe 5 seconds at best. Making the most of that time, Izime tried to clear away any bad blood, while explaining his reasoning in plain words. I stopped Crusher because I thought I needed to miss Psyis. Fine, I didn't help you, but I wasn't running the risk with everything else going on, so I made my move. Here's a bigger point, I didn't hurt anyone innocent and stopped Crusher, all that during the shit show last night? Izime rescinded his help, instead just shouldering his actions as his own, giving a tired sigh before he continued. That's saying something. Izime swallowed, taking a breath as stupid purple made him break another rule, no taking sides. Izime was well aware that painting himself as assisting the heroes was putting one foot solidly on their turf. Psyis wasn't the first hero he'd been directly involved with, but he hadn't show up on business. Not dropping in at some rented apartment with an idea to hop toxin or popping by NYC with a blueprint for some broke-down gizmo webboy could whip up for him. There's no reason to hold me against my will and what I assume is mentally assault Cradle and myself in some fashion. The whys don't just belong to you because you're used to taking them from everyone else without a question. Izime didn't bother trying to force the door, instead carefully curling his free arm under his upset companion so he had his runic hand free. I don't know you, so leave me alone. Giving a final nod, Izime snapped, leaving the famous psychic standing there still trying to find her words. Psyis blinked as the man she had intended to restrain was instead replaced with a few lingering sparks. The thoughts she'd had about her actions disappearing as she looked over towards the door she'd wasted her power on. Her efforts at locking and sealing the area had been laughable. No wonder he snorted. What use was a locked door against a magic? The man simply snapping out in a small shower of sparked reality after giving her a dressing down. He'd paid and sassed her one final time without even bothering to tip. Psyis looking back to the still as a statue shop owner, both of them blinking for a moment before looking down at the receipt in his hands. I? The shop owner simply shrugged, not sure what kind of villain he might be making an enemy of simply not wanting to give a reason for the remaining half of trouble to level his family's shop. Holding out the paper, the cook wondered how the noodle business got so damn dangerous. Hell, you can read minds, what's the use, lady? Simply glad that handing the receipt to Centropolis Angel brought a smile to her face instead of that cold look that made it seem like he would be moving shops unwillingly. The man quickly moving to start bagging the second set of 3 boxes as fast as he could, glad now that she'd ordered the same thing and he'd been able to cook it all at once. If he was fast enough, then maybe she'd be outside before she realized. I'm glad someone in here has some respect. Psyis reached out and carefully read over the information presented on the paper, turning it a few different directions before realizing the little clumps of printed zeros made a raven's head mid-core. Huh. Psyis tried to keep her calm, though it was slipping further, the inside of her lip peeling a bit as the mocking little head slowly crinkled under her grasp. Why your noodles? The cook held up another bag shakily, that telltale sigh of a woman's scorn reaching its peak, the siren signaling that he'd been just a bit too slow. Whatever the man had done, that bird being a snarky shit to a superpowered woman was probably the worst idea yet. That weird bird having just earned a noise the cook had only heard twice, each time from his wife, and neither time had ended well. A sound he remembered well, as each of those sighs had come from a different wife, and after, well, he was currently on his 3rd marriage. So hopefully the poor guy was better at arguing than he'd been. That sigh meant their little talk certainly wasn't over. That, or he'd at least make it a good distance away before being chased down by the obviously otherworldly woman. Red eyes looked towards the ceiling as Psyis turned back, the cook's shaky voice reminding her not only had she just lost her target. The smile she was giving was razor thin as she politely took the bag before snatched her receipt. She had lost the target, and it had cost her. Okay, that wasn't so bad, and the combo bowl did sound good. Maybe not 3 sets good, but the pepper and beef lo mein was a solid choice. Thank you. Psyis took the offered bag and paid the still trembling man, walking outside watching a few cars pass before promptly chucking the bag into the trash outside. Tongue running across her teeth angrily as she recalled the sarcastic little peace sign he'd given. Fuck that asshole's tastes, this is not over, stupid purple my left gill. Tensing her leg, Psyis let out a Thessian curse, wrapping her powers around herself and growling in frustration, she glanced skywards. Huffing so hard that her hoodie did actually flare a bit because of those gills. The extra oxygen she'd exhaled passing through her clothes as an alien body flushed its system with fresh oxygen in preparation for a fight. The city of Voltum could bill her for the crater she was going to leave in the pavement. Psyis thought, not caring how quickly she got over the city. Just knowing she couldn't scan at full power here, not at ground level. It would be an issue to accidentally level a block when she swept the entirety of Voltum at once for this fucker and his stupid bird. She leapt toward the sky, flying through the smog. The wind whistling by loud enough it drowned out the car alarms almost immediately as she rapidly climbed in altitude. Looking down as the buildings shrunk, city blocks now the size of the cartons she'd just thrown away, Psyis stopped her ascent. All right, bird boy, Psyis held on hand against her temple and held the palm of the other towards the city. Let's see who's stupid now. Red eyes went wide as her anger poured in, a dense purple half-shell blasting down and widening to land across the city in an invisible but surprisingly powerful pulse. Psyis bit her lips as she realized she may have just overdone things a bit. The air having actually distorted as her sweep crashed down over the entire miles-wide spread of Voltum. The faint chorus of thousands of car alarms activating at once, reaching her even all the way up here in the clouds. A symphony that told of incoming regret, its lyrics understood by her and that asshole alone. The rest of the city was likely in a slight panic, wondering what had just happened and which villain was to blame. Dark Knight's going to be flipping his cowl. Psyis pulled out her phone, wanting to get ahead of the problem, giving a hasty glance towards Blaine Tower in the distance. Wondering exactly where she should start, certainly not with her jumping the gun, the change in plans maybe. The update in information? 2 targets that were separate, and while not exactly hostile, they were very rude. Certainly, suspicious after last night as well, and if they moved quick, she could even catch him while he was eating. Pulling out her phone, she decided to send a quick text to Stephen Blaine's private line reserved for missions and emergencies. Condensing the mental list of traits into 7 words, she typed, "Found it, tracking difficult, sorry, big pulse coming again." Pressing send, Psyis quickly prepared her powers once more, though this time a bit more reasonably as she focused on certain areas. Her powers touching down like a spotted carpet across the city this time. Thinking it might follow it on the same odd random jumping pattern it had taken last night, Psyis released another more detailed pulse. Comparing the patterns of Voltum she had memorized from the earlier one against this newest, looking for the hole in the mental picture. Psyis stopped her ideas in their tracks as there was no need for a third pulse or any pattern at all. The void had simply moved to a dead-end alley not far from the noodle shop and wasn't leaving. Not a great place to be in Voltum, and certainly not the prime location for an evening meal. A decent place to box yourself in for a fight. Thought he didn't appear to be preparing for a fight. Sitting down instead with his takeout, the chance clearly there to run between pulses. He hadn't run away even given the gap as she'd texted. Instead it seemed he was starting the meal she'd interrupted. Psyis tried to take a step back from the situation and put herself in his shoes, filthy as they were. He made her angry, sure, but looking at it now, maybe he did have a point about her reasoning, even admitted he hadn't actually helped. Psyis held the phone a bit tighter as she looked down and considered her options now. Dark Knight was already aware she'd found it, let alone the trouble she'd caused here in Voltum. The man in yellow had a point too, at least from his point of view. Not like Dark Knight would care though. Even if she had been the one to burst in, the man had not even complained about the ruined chance of a warm meal indoors. Psyis biting her lip as she remembered that was wrong. He couldn't have eaten in there anyway. The shop owner had clearly not wanted him there, though he'd been willing to lie over it to keep the peace. Psyis recalling how the noodle chef had intended to separate them even before they'd started talking. The idiot, he'd already known the owner wanted him well away and even told her he'd had to leave. The sign was clearly and plainly written. He probably went through a few questions just to order that meal in the first place. The only real requests he'd made were that she refrain from using her pulses to irritate his bird and to leave him alone in general. He'd even chastised the bird over the little show of power, so reminding her to not invade his right to privacy without a reason was reasonable. Now she'd ignored his last request entirely and planned to drag 2 other heroes in to bug him. Not much of a surprise he'd vanished in the shop, having to deal with that. Now with her pulses and texting Dark Squire and Dark Knight as well? What kind of hero went and ruined a homeless man's meal and fought with his pet bird? Chasing him off only to do it all over a second time? Psyis rubbed at her temples, not sure if it was the sudden use of her full strength or the moral whiplash that was giving her a headache. Only sure she was going to head back down there and finish having this introduction out properly this time. Psyis knew she had to get something to hand over to Dark Knight to excuse that level of power use. At least she might be able to get a name, as technically he hadn't done anything wrong by her own standards, even her hero standards. Maybe tampering with evidence at best, but that was purely civilian, which the man in yellow obviously wasn't. He'd taken down Crusher at least, which definitely outweighed the issue with taking Fearform's trap and showed some skill. Though there was the body they had found at the processing plant, there had been quite a few bodies though. That one's death just hadn't been caused by a comrade's toxin-induced friendly fire, so it was odd. Psyis had ended a few lives as well, though both human and alien, and no one had chased her down. Certainly not something that deserved a trio of supers chasing him down. Psyis didn't hold herself to Dark Knight's unreasonable moral code. The math behind the Gloomy Cape's quote was stupid in its own right and wouldn't pass a logic check. Psyis pulled out her phone a second time as she realized there would soon a party of upper-level supers crashing a dumpster dinner. Typing as she slowly descended, she sent another quick message to Steven, going to talk. Will contact for backup if need. She hoped the two took their time at least, knowing that Steven was likely going to completely ignore the implications that she had this in hand. It was only a matter of time until at least one of them showed up. Psyis was dead set on having at least some form of communication with the idiot below before that happened, dropping further and a bit faster. The wind passing by much slower as she finally lowered herself to a nearby roof, looking down to observe the man a bit further, touching down to catch a bit of the conversation drifting up from below, the man still chastising the raven for its own instigation. Psyis couldn't help but frown a bit as she recalled her earlier thoughts, though it did soften a bit as she heard the two interact. It hadn't been entirely the raven's fault. The nature of their relationship was obviously very close thought, even if one was an impossible machine and the other a possible human. Brushing away the long white hair that was blown in her way by the rooftop breeze, she glanced below to watch quietly as a yellow figure sidestepped a raven, finger wagging in disappointment, the absolute idiot that he was. Psyis felt her lips curl. She could make names up to. The Raven's Basilisk. Chapter 10. Exchanging names at last. Come on, Cradle. Izime scratched at the black beak that was nipping at him accusingly. She's way out of our league, both of ours. That's Miss Psyis. Izime still refusing to release the bird as Miss Psyis' little tantrum had riled it up once more. The bundle of black metal feathers looking all the more puffed and chicken-like the longer it wiggled about attempting to escape. Sighing with his own frustrations, Izime glanced around the alley they ducked into. A few cans and paper still settling from the psychic pulse that had no doubt been looking for him. Fight good. Cradle croaked back, not quite convinced the two couldn't hold their own against the alien. Squirming still, it was cooling off a bit though. The ruffling of Cradle squirming, its own form of self-inflicted punishment, all that careful preening ruined. No longer so agitated at the alien that had tried to invade its bond that it was willing to directly disobey, though that massive blast had certainly been one loud call, it still didn't get through their bond. The shielding nanet still absorbing and wasting away the Thessian's energy. Now it just wanted down so it could fix all the plumage that had been mussed about during Izime's cradling of it. You sure do, but not her, Izime nodded, sitting down the bag of food so he could give the raven's crop a good rub, still stern in his refusal, but proud of his bond's fierce nature. Ordering Cradle to burn off that angry energy quickly. Now stay down here and get all that fight out of your system. Izime gave a slight toss of the bald raven, forcing Cradle to take to wing. Watching as the bird cut an impossibly tight circle in the narrow alley and landed back near him. Hopping around for a moment before fluttering over to the bag of takeout he had just placed down. Izime's slight irritation at Cradle's disobeying disappeared as soon as the raven opened its beak. Eat! Cradle ordered back, happy to share in the cycle of care. Hopping towards the bags of noodles Izime had sat down and giving them a few cursory pecks. Finally managing to pop one of the boxes open, it nodded at Izime with pride. Eat! Giving a few flaps, Cradle took off a little ways, landing on the edge of the dumpster for a moment before taking off once again. This time doing a tiny loop in the narrow alley, making sure it listened to Izime's orders to fly low and play about. Cradle keeping itself well down inside the alley and performing a little aerial display for Izime. I will. Izime clapped his hands in order to get the raven's attention as it picked up speed. Not wanting Cradle to get too excited and decide to fly off, picking a fight with a certain alien. But you play down low and no scanning, you two were fighting over that shit and we don't start fights. Cradle is a good bird. Izime ignored the taunting Cradle was doing as the raven was indeed playing low, directly near his head. Instead reaching out and grabbing the box Cradle had opened out of the plastic bag. Looking around for a moment inside, he found the wrapped chopsticks beside a chilled bottle of water. Sitting the box on the edge of the nearby dumpster, Izime tore the sticks apart and tossed the paper in, before sitting down against the dark green steel to eat. Smells be damned, he was probably a few days away passing out from not malnutrition again. Actual nutrients and not just calories of some kind was a must right now. Glancing up, Izime stopped during his second bite, Cradle's voice bringing his attention to the bird, who was currently doing a surprisingly accurate impression of a woodchipper combined with a blender, all while still flying. Fight good. Cradle called back, passing its bond as it slowed its flight, letting the various feathered blades twirl about just to prove its point. If we get hit, we hit back, but no starting fights, not even name calling. Izime shook his head, denying the raven again, carefully standing so he didn't spill his box of noodles. Cradle is a good birdie, not a mean birdie. With zero thought to the feathers of death, Izime walked over, blocking the bird physically mid-flight. Smiling as Cradle halted mid-air, Izime gave it an admonishing with his chopsticks. First a tap on the head before giving the hovering mech raven a poke in the midsection before it hovered higher to escape. Izime paused for a moment, eyes leaving Cradle as he looked at the shadows that stretched along the bricks. Ignoring the happy wiggles Cradle was giving at the title of good birdie, eyes drawn to the part of the shadow that wasn't straight-lined. Fuck, I just needed to eat. Izime thought to himself as he tried to shove the noodles in just that tiny bit faster. At least wanting to make the most of the now familiar-looking hooded silhouette staying above them in the alley, not just dropping in to harass them again. Cradle, go play far. Izime waved his hand, trying to conceal his anger as he quickly finished his first box of noodles, hoping the bird would simply take the chance to roam around Voltum freely. The bond was closed tight enough that Cradle wouldn't be able to sense his thoughts about their company, but this needed to be settled without the bird around for now. Apparently, she wanted it settled as well, so Izime tried to send his more aggravated half away. Cradle was obviously still looking for a fight. Izime wiping the sauce of his mouth and taking a few swigs from the bottle of water in the bag before tossing it back into the bag. Looking at the still waiting raven in held expectation, gesturing again to take the opportunity with a bit softer tone this time. Go play, go eat, Cradle. Play low? Cradle landed on the nearby dumpster, tilting its head in confusion. Izime had definitely told it to stay low because he knew Stupid Purple was searching. Even Izime had felt the pulse earlier, and now he said Cradle could go high? Not anymore, this is important, so listen. Go play somewhere for 1 hour and actually play, no scanning, none. You can even go eat at the snack on some radio towers or something, I'll be fine, but Izime waggled his fingers, hoping Cradle still trusted his snaps despite the time it had failed them, giving a pause as he considered who he was about to talk to. If I'm not here, call me. Cradle hopped down to the street, pausing for a moment, not sure it had been that good and almost positive something else was going on. All the same, it didn't want to waste the opportunity. Eating items off the forbidden menu was reserved for special occasions like its hatching day, so it was best to take to the air now while Izime was still being really generous. With a final hop, Cradle decided to depart, giving a tilting look back before bolting away. Eat! A black streak cried joyfully as it rocketed out of the alley. Psyis heard the bird go flying off, a bit shocked at the sudden speed. Ducking from the current of air before risking a glance back down into the alley, only to see another face looking back up at her. Izime breathed out of his nose in frustration, ignoring the warmth of Thai chili as it worked its way out his nose. The hood of his coat crinkling slightly as his neck was tilted, eyes watching the bit of white that had made their eavesdrop so easily identifiable. The long mohawk waving gently in the unshielded winds of the roof, Izime had figured she'd be by quickly but not immediately. At least figuring he'd had time to eat before, well, he was working on superhero time here, so maybe it should have been expected. Do I need to talk you down too? Izime called up loudly, glaring at the purple face that was looking down at him. If you can be nice, I'll talk for a bit. Izime's eyes went wide as the Thessian jumped from the roof and just fell. That crazy woman. White mohawk standing properly as she descended from the air, rushing past. Even her hoodie billowing and giving Izime a rather embarrassing view under her shirt. Teal eyes quickly glancing away from a toned and two-toned midsection towards the more comfortable bricks. Psyis started to yell back down, giving a cautious glance towards the sky before simply shaking her head and hoping off the roof. The bird had disappeared already and certainly hadn't heard her, probably. Looking down instead to see the ground as it came whistling towards her. Trying to stifle a laugh as the man quickly backpedaled away from her landing spot as she had just let gravity take her. Halting just a hair's breadth from the pavement, Psyis caught herself and brushed at the wrinkles her fall had caused. Pulling her hoodie a bit straighter before finally releasing her grip and allowing her feet to touch the street below her. I'm sorry about the thing at the noodle shop. Psyis offered her own attempt at a conversational truce at least, brushing her hair out of the way as she led in with an apology. Brows holding steady but tensely as Psyis tried a proper introduction this time, an attempt at keeping her cool instead of just coming in capes drawn. She wasn't going to offer some excuse that Stephen had upset her or she had been looking for a fight. Those were both childish and one man had no reason to hear, the other was an even worse excuse. Still, she had to get something to show for the trouble she'd caused Dark Knight without causing more trouble now. I can promise you Cradle is not, so don't poke my bird and don't poke me. Izime shook his head at the psychic's shallow apology, gesturing with one hand while reaching for more noodles with his other. I can't even say I'm okay with the concept of you kicking in a door to just kick in someone's mental doors without a Val 3. Psyis was at first upset that he'd tossed aside her apology. Again, the man was just dead set on being rude. That flicker of anger lasting only a second as Psyis finally got the first real response out of him, the brown eyes furrowing as his teal eyes ran over her arms and to her hands before returning. Giving her an accusatory glare that had tripped her irritation mid-slide. She hadn't done anything this time. Izime trailed off his hand, stopping, giving a sideways look at the alien's empty arms. The alien had ordered the same as him, a triple bowl of Thai pepper beef lo mein. Izime knew how fast he could eat and for once found himself hoping someone could eat faster than him, though he knew what the more likely option was. Anger seeping into Izime's bones, not even wanting to look at the hero anymore. Everyone here was so damned wasteful towards damned near everything, no respect for the cards luck had handed them with this reality. Where are your noodles? Izime asked after taking a steadying breath, doubt slowing his words as he already knew what the answer was. She didn't even smell like chilies. I am. Psyis looked back down the alley. It wasn't far, but that sidewalk and had looked, well, wet was probably the best description. Shame creeping in as she decided to finish answering him honestly, threw them away. Holding her head a bit lower in shame as she saw the expected reaction come, she had fucked up once again. Psyis watched as the homeless man's shoulders dropped with nothing but absolute disappointment in her. The noise she had waited for didn't, however. Instead of cursing or yelling, he immediately closing his bag back with a twist. Glancing at the street and the trash around them as he took a deep breath, obviously trying to calm himself. Casting her the occasional quick glance before rubbing at his face and ordering her to remain. Though with a much softer tone that carried the heavy weight of helplessness with that disappointment. Ain't you just? Izime shook his head, running a hand through his hair in sheer agitation as he considered his options. Seeing as stupid purple had decided to earn her name solidly this time and wasted food. Izime stomped past her, pointing at the alien and then at the ground as he made a decision. You stay here. Izime recalled the front of the shop and snapped his fingers. It wasn't a thing he usually did, using magic so openly and appearing at a busy intersection, but it'd only take a minute and honestly. The Thessian had pissed him off well and good now, the first alien he'd met living any sort of decent life, and she was no better than the Lux Winthor, wasteful and ignorant of all they'd been blessed with. Psyis kept looking at the bag of perfectly good food the man had just left behind with a snap, his intentions obvious. Harassing him had been forgivable, probably a usual considering how he dressed. Maybe the who and why was a bit unexpected, but that hadn't crossed his line. Pitching an entire bag of food certainly had. A few minutes passing, the noodles sitting in the bag reaching out with their beefy goodness and cursing her with a twinge of hunger. The order had looked good, and she'd trashed it for the stupidest reasons. Even after paying for the food, if she hadn't wanted it she could have given it away. Dark Knight and Dark Squire could have waited, it wasn't like it had even ran, and if she'd been a bit more reasonable, she could have just taken the bag with her. A still unfamiliar crackle behind Psyis giving her a start, though she wasn't really surprised when she turned to see a very judgmental pair of teal eyes passing her. The bits of dirt drawing darker lines in his frown as he stormed past her, a familiar bag in his hands with bits of other refuse still stuck to it. A bit of something dark and thick pooling in a corner of the clear plastic, whatever it was, it certainly was cola. Walking over to the dumpster, he looked between the two bags as if deciding something. Psyis swallowing dryly as she considered what she might do in such a situation. Punishment should fit the crime after all, so it would be deserved to make her finish the meal she had bought. He wasn't that cruel though, besides being a bit of a demon gave an advantage to psychological warfare. Izime intending to take the psychic on an entire guilt cruise, let alone a simple trip, complete with multiple stops and a dinner show. I don't care if you aren't hungry. Izime sat the trashed bag down, pulling out a half-crushed paper box. It was at least the better looking out of the three. Nodding, he looked at one of his own UN trashed containers. You ordered it, you're gonna eat it. Taking his chopsticks and pouring a bit of water over them, Izime gave them a hard shake before wiping them on his pants. Popping to the top of a nicer box, he stuffed them inside. Finally taking both, he walked back over to the Miss Psyis with every intention of making her eat crow. Psyis avoiding even looking as he approached, the weight in those eyes feeling like a headman's axe. Izime stopped raising a brow, just a foot away, and she still hadn't spared him a glance. That was fine, the psychic didn't need to look, she was the hero after all, she could handle a bit of crow. Izime looking at the boxes of food as he tried to recall the entire speech he had prepared in the meantime, wanting to play the proper villain at this exact moment. The stupid alien had pushed his button since they'd met, so it seemed fair after all. I know a little girl in Centropolis that would fight her own dad and me before she'd ever believe the Miss Psyis would be anything less than perfect. Her hero would never waste a bit, let alone a meal. We've been using you to convince her to eat onions for years, you can't finish a box of noodle. Izime gave the noodles a few shakes of guilt before shoving the untrashed box of noodles into the alien's chest. Ignoring the soft cushion as he applied a bit of force, eat it. Psyis looked down at the box she was being punished with as the soft paper box folded slightly, the force pushing against her hoodie and into the valley of her chest. The unwrapped and already used chopsticks were a bit uncomfortable, but he had cleaned them as best he could. That was the worst of it, however. The box in Izime's hand was actually exposed to everything in that trash can, the paper already holding a dark stain from that something in the bag. Though that same hand was currently driving a box of noodles into her cleavage, Psyis glanced to chastise him for thinking he was slick. Red brows furrowing only to relax, finding a face that had none of her discomfort. She didn't need to read the man's mind to know he wasn't using this as an excuse to get close to her, this was an entirely noodle-focused situation. The man's gentle push building as the box crinkled further, his gaze on her not faltering in the slightest. That man cooked 2 orders, and we scared the shit out of him, so someone's eating them and you were half the problem if not the whole damn thing. I don't care about the trash, not one bit. Izime pinched a clump of noodles between his fingers, nodding towards the good carton, and I'm not getting my ass kicked by Shya because I made her hero eat trash like us, even if that would be the better lesson. Eat the damned noodle, Psyis. Izime quickly pulled his hand free as 2 purple and blue stripped hands reached up to take the box, a bit surprised to not hear any more arguments. Even more surprised to see the alien actually take the chopsticks in her delicate-looking hands, watching as she carefully swirled a clump of noodles. Giving a curious sniff as she eyed the thin strips of beef mixed in with the lomine and herbs, all coated in a heavy reddish oil as she took the bite. Psyis wondering for a moment who was the hero here, not that Izime had saved the day, but where exactly had he learned that level of attitude that could talk down to someone like her? No, he wasn't a hero, but what kind of monster would she be if she went against him now? Wasting food that she knew very well others on her planet were dying for, quite literally. She wasn't going to refute him, the argument he'd made was solid if personally based, besides the noodles smelled really good. Psyis glanced at the spicy-smelling noodles before finally stuffing the entire clump in her mouth and chewing thoughtfully. Glancing about the alley idly before glancing up for half a second, covering her mouth in embarrassment as she caught an eager nod from her side. The man's next word still irritating, somehow, even when he was being nice. The peppers were the perfect touch of heat and something she'd have ordered herself, though it seemed her pleased look had only inflated his ego further. Told you I had good tastes. Izime felt his smirk widen as the Thai chilies the cook had added extra F started to kick in. The psychic's purple and blue cheeks blurring in with a mix of magenta as the heat from the chilies was filling her body. Izime finished filling his own mouth before sucking his own fingers clean of the delicious oils that had dripped over them. Noodles weren't exactly finger food, but that hardly stopped a dedicated individual. Izime quickly stuffing in 2 more fingerfuls before he even attempted to chew. Not ashamed in the least after the few years of being in this world. If someone wanted to get judgy, they could go around with the strangelets and get back to him, see how much they cared about table manners after their table changed its state of matter. Watching the man literally stuff his face at first, Psyis was a bit disgusted at the clash between his attitude and behavior, then a bit of worry crossed her mind. Placing the chopsticks back in her own box, she went ahead and asked, thoughts of getting information falling second to that uncomfortable worry. When was the last time you ate? Done member Izime shrugged while trying to talk through a mouthful of noodles, not really concerned about satisfying a sensation he didn't feel anymore. It had been annoying the years he'd dealt with it, now living a bit in between for both form and function was certainly more comfortable. Sometimes it became an issue when he needed to do delicate work and had the shakes or started having difficulty thinking. Beyond that, Izime knew his own efficiency had increased, much less time worried about eating. Izime thankful he was avoiding a good portion of the massive time sink that most carbon-based forms dealt with. Sure, there were some problems, but the drawbacks were minor in comparison to the abilities Cradle had given him. What was hunger compared to thermal imaging and the always active access they shared to the internet, galactic infoweb, and the thousands of other cool tricks he could now do again? For a natural-born human, the flood of information might be a bit daunting, or the loss of naturally felt instincts disturbing. Izime knew he was different. He'd been closer to Cradle than a human at first. That slice of familiarity was a comforting feeling in this wildest world. At least a month, unless you're counting Jovian caloric cubes. Izime searched his mind for the last actual human meal he had eaten, figuring the beans he had lost didn't count anymore. The caloric cubes were almost a comfort food considering the mold blocks he'd been raised on. As for human food, maybe when he had first gotten back in Centropolis as celebrated with Wesson and Shya. Yeah, that was it. McDonald's. Izime explained while his hand chased that talking mouth with a pinch of noodles, finally stuffing them in after he'd finished. Izime nodded, still chewing for a moment longer, then he paused before gesturing with sauce dripping from his fingers to continue. Wesson and Shya wanted ice cream, so I snapped to 5 or 6 different McDonald's to check their ice cream machines. There was only one on the far side of Gateway. That was a hell of a walk with a 9-year-old. Gateway Bridge in Centropolis? Psyis cocked her head, finally picking her own chopsticks back up to work on her own box as well. Brows raising as she realized she wasn't the only person from Centropolis here on work. The man hadn't been following her like Dark Knight had tried to lead her to believe. Yep, Izime put a little pop on that pee as he tossed the now empty box into the dumpster, hoping humanizing himself for the hero would at least get her to pull her claws back. There was probably little point in lying to the psychic anyway. If she ever did meet Wesson, the man would be an open book. Finally deciding the information he had shared was safe enough, he sat the box on the dumpster and prepared himself. The flip side of not feeling hungry was not feeling full as well, and this would be his third box. Izime raised his arms and stretched, letting his stomach adjust as he physically prepared to tackle the end of his meal. Grabbing another box, Izime kept his ears trained to the noises behind him. Psyis quickly pulled out her phone, not wanting the dark duo to interrupt her conversation by bursting in all dark harangues and dark foo on the poor guy. Feeling a bit sorry she'd blown her lid after Steven's little show, though this idiot certainly hadn't done anything to help himself. They were still having a decent conversation right now, and there was no reason to let the dark duo come in capes blazing. Clicking through her messages, she tensed as she read Steven's many replies and Stan's one. It was too late, as it seemed Stan was already back from the Blaine Tower and apparently done suiting up. Probably finished prepping a vehicle that could touching the clouds to rocket out of the underground even as she read the message. I, or we. Wesson, Shya, and me play in the shopping districts. You should stop by there, but only on a weekend. Shya would flip, quite literally. Izime prattled on, pretending to be unaware of the psychic using her phone behind him. Was it just a thing in this world, the odd ticks that the comic authors had worked in? Were some heroes just ironically not self-aware, or, no, that wasn't it? Izime recalled, there had been a few that typed loudly back then as well. Those advanced monitors on that station trapped in time had silent options too, Izime tasting a bit of similarity between worlds in human nature. Or rather the nature of all sentient life to goof occasionally. The alien behind him, seemingly unaware the device in her hand had a very click-Y keypad. We busk, that's our, we play for change from the shoppers. Just some easy cover songs, but I think we're better than Jamie Torch. Dude's a hack honestly, but still Izime kept going, trying to find enough words to fill the seconds it was taking Psyis to message to who he could only assume was one of the Blaines. Pretending to pick a few things out of the bag in the meantime, just tearing some bits of napkin as he continued, usually scores us enough to keep Shya in decent clothes and both of them out of shelters. Wesson and you are? Psyis sent a few quick texts that she hoped would at least delay the two. If Psyis could keep him opening up, then all she needed to do was take that info back and she could keep both sides happy. Dark Knight would have his answers and Izime could just go on about his day. Though that still left the question of how satisfied Dark Knight would be with those answers. Family, he's my brother. Izime nodded, happy to explain the relationship. It was a good enough topic to waste the time on. Finally taking the bottle of water and finishing it, now that the phone was safely pocketed, he could get back to eating, as annoying as it was. You'll tell me all this but not your name? Psyis tried again, seeing as the man was willing to talk about family. Once again pressing him for a name, something more tangible than the idle small talk she was getting, the few leads basically nothing really. Certainly not enough to give Dark Knight an excuse for abusing her powers earlier. I don't do the whole name thing, or the villain-hero gimmick stuff. Izime tried to explain why he wasn't giving a name. He really didn't have a title or anything like that, and certainly wasn't involved in that particular scene, at least directly. Maybe the salesman or something would have a good ring to it, but that just made it sound like he needed to be in a suit, and that was not happening. There were a few names that had been thrown around back in the day, here though he'd rather just stick to being called the nickname he'd chosen. Bell liked to say he was one, so he'd bastardized the word bully for his own purposes. My actual name's just Psyis. The alien hoped the useless tidbit would even the field between them. Though the response she got was what she expected, a laughable no. You are also easily identifiable as the 5'11" lightning pattern Smurf, besides everyone knows your information thanks to Joey James' tone. Izime cocked his head and explained while wiping away a bit of noodle and oil, "Kinda sucks you had to do all that publicity stuff just to get the razzie of your back though. At least Webboy took the heat for you after a while." Thinking back to what he knew, Izime recalled all the headlines about the brain-corrupting alien on the streets of Centropolis, Joey stacking towers of those tabloid releases about the Thessian mind invader from NYC to San Diego. The man had probably felt so recognized and affirmed when he'd had something actually real to point at and throw his fits about. Though it hadn't been focused on her heroics but the possible misuse of her powers. Then he'd wound up with a hero on his front doorstep leaving piles of web everywhere, so of course his focus had shifted. Grumpy old bastard couldn't stand having a teen super on his lawn. Izime's thoughts about his more tech-creative business partner fading as Psyis asked a question he should have expected. "What's a Smurf?" Psyis tilted her head, unsure if she was being insulted, never having heard the term, decidedly passing over Izime's knowledge of her less proud history when she had still been earning her place as a human. James' tone was a complete hack and an asshole, not a person she'd like to casually discuss over noodles. Those angry memories easily heating Psyis more than any number of peppers. "Don't worry about it, just know you'd be the tallest one." Izime waved his hand dismissively, not bothering to explain in the slightest. Goddamned nerds had saved the absolute stupidest things, now who could he talk to about it all? Izime held back his sigh. He had helped them and read it all too, even bothered with remembering that trash. Counting the bricks, Izime tried to think of who he could blame, the finger he was pointing always spinning back. Maybe this was all still his fault. If he'd been better, they'd never needed to save anything. Now he kept catching himself, bringing things like Smurfs up casually, little stupid pop culture references that just didn't translate to here. It was an oddly painful punishment for failure. Wesson had taken at least 2 years to stop asking pointlessly complicated questions like Psyis just had. What's a Smurf? What's a yeet? What's aura? An Uber? And so on to ad nauseum. Don't even get him started on the whole Amazon Prime talk when there were actual Amazon warriors here, an entire universe of human culture, and it was all 15 degrees of fucked from this one. "So can I get your actual name?" Psyis held out her hands helplessly, exasperated as it dawned on her. She was not exactly the best at interrogation when she couldn't mentally crack her targets. "Izime," Izime murmured, his mind elsewhere before glancing at Psyis, then down at the tail of noodles in his mouth. Slurping them down quickly as he beat his chest, trying not to choke, ignoring the blush as he reminded himself that talking and eating at the same time wasn't so easy. "Sorry," Izime quickly finished chewing and swallowed, pronouncing the favored nickname properly this time. "My name is Izime. No last name?" Psyis already knew she'd need more to go off of. She'd been half banking on the human disposition to give full names as a greeting. "Where's yours?" Izime shot back without missing a beat, though he already knew the answer, perks of being a comic aficionado outside of this reality from beforehand. Though the fact he had to die to make that knowledge useful was a bit sad. Thessians typically don't gain a second name for a good while, until they're well into their maturity. Psyis crossed her arms, not wanting to explain the intricacies of her species' culture to some random homeless magician. Psyis' mouth dropping a bit as the random homeless magician threw a very personal insult at her. Not quite knowing what to say or how to refute the absolutely ignorant words. "Oh, so no Psyis Blaine yet?" Izime waggled his eyebrows and gave a shit-eating grin, clamping his mouth immediately as he saw the Thessian's brows furrow to new depths. Quickly apologizing, apparently having dilely misjudged the situation. "Sorry, that was a bit out of line." It was common knowledge to Izime at least, Thessians wouldn't take a second name until they bonded, much like the one he shared with Cradle. Just not technologically, but naturally through their own species' psychic means. When they had existed in any number greater than 1, the second name had signified the Thessian was fully bonded, the two psychics having individual bodies but essentially one mind. Addressing a bonded Thessian by the names of both individuals was proper, the two shared their thoughts constantly, so you were talking to both anyway. "I?" Psyis' eyes narrowed as she felt like Izime knew more than he was letting on. The question loaded even by Thessian standards, as if the man knew about her intimate life. "That is none of your business." Psyis stood quietly, chopsticks working at half speed while her mind whirled away. Just what did this Izime actually know about her? He'd just dropped Steven's name as casually as if he'd been the one double dating with them and no John Sent and his Martian girlfriend. Her opinions on the homeless man awash, as he seemed to honestly apologize for the overstep. Though it didn't explain how he'd known about her and Steven once being in a relationship in the first place. "True enough, I crossed a line there." Izime bowed his head a bit in apology, letting the silence carry for a moment before attempting to recover the topic. "But I really only have the first name." Maybe before he could have seen if one of the crew could adopt him, but the decision hadn't been his to make and time had slipped away before he could ask. Izime not sure if the food had suddenly gotten tastier or if the memory had actually roused his dead sense of hunger. Simply eating away at his feelings as his mind wandered away from the lost moment in time. The two munching for a bit in silence, the chill pulling the steam from the noodles wafting away as cars passed outside the alley. Psyis giving a slight chuckle as she watched the human give a long look at her bottle of water, opening it and handing it over. Psyis raised her own brow towards the peppered beef, the snark not being completely silenced by the question she asked instead of poking fun. So, what do you do with the traps you take? Psyis finally finished her box of noodles, asking another question as she threw the box away. Walking closer, a bit surprised to find that Izime's clothes, while dirty, weren't badly maintained. The grime that was visible looked like things that couldn't be easily removed from the tightly woven odd fabric the patch coat was made of. The man himself looked a mess of noodles and flushed face as he looked at the box he had tried to eat with a bit of regret. Psyis tried to find all the boxes in the dumpster discreetly before walking back. It was already his fourth. That was a bit of heat but a lot of food, the psychic wondering again about Izime's health. The ones from last night? Probably sell the tanks of fear toxin to Constantinople, the stuff's a hit in the 9 hells and great for dealing. A lot of those cable throwers I'll sell as is to some bounty hunters off-world. Izime considered some of the more acceptable options he had considered. The quiz is actually somewhat famous for having some of the best criminal capture devices this side of Orion's arm. It was a bit regretful to name-drop the exorcist, but he was reputable at least with the Blaines to some degree, and the words were honest enough. The slang-slinging British exorcist paid good money, sometimes. Usually just dropped a bunch of gems on him though before running back to smoke out the demons of hell in yellow fumes. Izime close enough after a few run-ins to mention the anti-hero without too much hesitation. Off-world? Psyis raised her eyebrows, not quite believing Izime was as widely travelled as he was bragging about. The man got around sure, but off-planet was a bit of a milestone for Earth-based heroes. If it was true, someone besides Constantinople should have been aware of the man, right? The Vidan security consulate will probably give me a few thousand in sole credit for the lot, but selling them individually lets me price gouge accordingly, Izime explained as he dug around for a pinch with a bit more beef. Finally getting a good scoop, he continued, I'll actually be in Voltum for a few more weeks, so don't be surprised if you see me around. After that, who knows? Maybe hawking some power crystals to the ring bearers on Zythomia, maybe in NYC trading some doohickey to that web-slinger for some custom work. Maybe in Centropolis singing That's My Family's Home, so. I'm planning on leaving once we track down Fear Form. Psyis explained her own plans, ignoring the vibrating from her pocket for a second time. Appreciating Izime being candid about his activity in her hometown. Not completely willing to call his words a lie, she'd still double-check, but he seemed to be telling the truth. At least as far as a psychic whose powers couldn't work on him could tell. There were some names there she'd recognized. Hell, working with a green ring who had to report to Zythomia, it was a planet she had visited before herself. She could easily see the Galactic Police Force from Viadan purchasing a batch of high-end non-lethal detainment devices. Let alone all the individual bounty hunters that were out catching minor criminals. They would certainly pay a hefty sum for a high-end toy that made their job easier. Exactly like the quiz's classic cable throwers. At least use a personal shield this time. Izime tapped his chin while he considered the psychic's predicament last night, trying to wrap up their talk with the issues he had. Stressing your powers with secondary charges is probably going to be Fearform's move now that he knows you're in Voltum. I can handle myself. Psyis rolled her eyes, giving the struggling not hero a loaded look from head to toe, considering Izime's advice with a hint of disdain. What about you and Crusher? The man seemed to be a low-level magician with some decent skills and a very high-end pet. Sure, he had an opinion, but was it really useful to someone who could just stop the bullets he needed to dodge? If Crusher got a hold of Izime and all the protection he had was a low-end spell and no Cradle, Psyis could at least hit back harder than the wrestler could hit her. Izime was just a punching bag. I'll be fine, I accepted the risk, but remember it's not your funeral if you get dosed or going to be just yours. Izime tried to adjust the edge of his point, giving the alien a sideways look while tossing the third empty box. Anyone you get a hold of until Dark Knight or Radiation Man shows up to bring you down is at risk. Psyis was about to respond until she saw Izime look up, turning to see a somewhat familiar bird flying in small circles above them. The alien tensing, the hour certainly wasn't up, so there was no reason for Izime's bond to return unless there was a problem. There was one. Psyis realizing why the topic has suddenly changed. She had messaged for backup earlier, and it was getting close enough that Izime was calling a close to this impromptu meet. Psyis turned, wanting to explain that she hadn't intended to try and play for time. The entire talk was just an attempt at reconciling her earlier actions. At least to get that in and not end on another sour note, a bit self-conscious as she had no clue how he currently felt. Coughing slightly, Psyis saw Izime giving her a knowing look as the alien tried to take the floor as steadily as she could. I contacted them before, when I didn't know, we were just going to talk and... I'm sorry again. Psyis let her head fall to the side a bit, knowing she couldn't undo what she had done. Dark Knight was already en route, and with Cradle around there was no missing his approach. Brushing her hair out of her eyes as Izime gave a thoughtful frown. Well, it was a talk, one of the talks of all time, but I think the Dark Duo is coming to do more than just chat, so I've got to get going. Izime gave Psyis' apology a bit of consideration before pointing at her with a finger gun, guitar case already back over his shoulder and holding what remained of his dinner. Thanks for the little chat, next time let's do this without the whole setup, okay? Pulling his hand back up, Izime snapped away while reaching out to Cradle through their bond. Directing the Raven to completely avoid the area and return to the sealed underground safe house, before adding an addition, not wanting to give Cradle an excuse. Go straight to the sewers. Leave her alone. Stupid purple. Izime couldn't help but laugh and agree as he reached for the light switch in the dark. Cradle obviously still on guard against the Thessian that had snuck under its detection and riled it up. Personal Izime was more concerned with the contents of his sealed box. Was it safe to keep the food in the same box as the questionable nanits? Was it even temperature controlled? Probably not, but a vacuum was still decent storage, right? Izime deciding that worrying about his fresh food stockpile was more productive than wasting his thoughts on the purple alien. The Raven's Basilisk. Chapter 11. Inviting trouble. Stephen Blaine clenched his fists in frustration while he looked at his fellow member in the YPS. The young Planetary Saviors were supposed to be the backup in training replacements for the actual League of Planetary Saviors. Here he stood watching the woman he looked up to, respected even, trying to explain her attempt in tracking and interrogation. Red Eye searching the floor for an excuse Stephen knew didn't exist as a striped hand awkwardly rubbed at a hooded arm. It was almost impossible to believe she'd ever been promoted to the League of Saviors proper, let alone before him. Closing his eyes in sheer irritability, even Stephen couldn't excuse her this time. There was no attempt at any kind of secrecy. After blasting the entire city of Voltum with a mental search twice, causing no small amount of alarm, the most she had to show for it was a name and a contact. One that was likely fake. The only thing they had accomplished was giving their target every single advantage on a silver platter. You were in over your head. Stephen couldn't help himself, shaking his head as he finally voiced his disappointment. So far over your head, PSY. What the hell were you thinking? What was I? Psyis looked up at the lesser half of the equation that had ruined her talk, defensively attacking their own attempts. Yes, I was rash. Fine, Stephen. How were you planning on finding him? Weeks of camera tracking while you trying and calculate the perfect little fixed schedule or path. Waiting and trying a reactionary plan that locks down a portion of the city with Constantinople's help, which by the way he probably be providing. Arms held out in exasperation, Psyis threw Stan's most likely plans in Stephen's face. Izime hadn't acted the least bit concerned about her beyond being mad she was interrupting his meal. Psyis figured the odds were the man stood firmly on a hill of evidence that supported those actions. Either knowing Constantinople would help him or Izime was already prepared to counter any of their powers. Something that was entirely possible considering he stocked gear from Dark Knight himself. Any moves they might make were probably already considered and stonewalled by the man. I don't work on probables. Stan Blaine leaned forward in his chair, the chill air of the dark cave sharpening his mental focus. I want to go back to the conversation you had, the little details. Izime knows there's a connection between Dark Knight and Blaine Enterprise. He knows our secret identities. Stan looked at Stephen meaningfully. Their secret identities were of the utmost priority. Their security ensured any friends or family stayed safe. It kept rival moguls like Lux Winthor from making moves on both fronts. The tech-reliant philanthropist villain already gave Radiation Man a run for his money, let alone literally attempting to do so with Blaine Enterprises. He knew we were a thing. Psyis glanced at Stephen before agreeing with Stan's issue. Izime's knowledge was invasive to say the least. Even if he did scavenge some of your things, personal levels of information like that bothers me. If he knows I'm Dark Squire, it's not a surprise he made the connection. Stephen waved away the alien's concern. There wasn't any issue with the man knowing they were an item or had been just a short while ago. We weren't exactly subtle. Our best move right now is to check the black market starting with Constantinople. We've got a name, so let's see if that even clears. Stan quickly pressed a few buttons, the massive computer screen uselessly flipping to display a prompt in 167-point Arial. The word scrolling repeatedly as the phone rang throughout the cavern. Calling Constantinople, calling Constantinople, calling Constantinople, calling Constantinople, calling. A rattling click came as the call was answered, a heavy British accent coming across as the screen flickered over to a video feed. A shaggy crop of blonde hair and 12 o'clock shadow rimming dark eyes as Constantinople face filled the screen. A moment of worry flashing across the British man's face before he smiled snarkily and greeted the trio. Well, I should be off to save the Queen then. It must be a true emergency for my favorite dark, cowled and gloomy to call while the sun's still up. The sun is still up there, right? No demon Eckley dash. Constantinople. Stan cut the moody exorcist off, wanting to try and sidestep his way into the main topic quickly. How's the demon dealing business going? Still got 5 takers on my soul, Dark, and a few new off dash. Constantinople laughed as he recalled the usual jibes people made about him. Sure, there were some deals made, but they were beneficial to others, not just himself. The chuckle turning into a cough as Stan's voice came through again, the tone heavy with Voltum gloom and a promise to come and share it. Let me rephrase, Constantinople, how's the fear toxin dealing going? Stan leaned forward, his dark lines creeping in around his eyes, implying that the question was only going to be asked once. Listen, Dark Knight. I'm going through a tunnel, yeah, bad reception in purgatory and all. Gonna have to let yo dash. Constantinople started to put the phone away, cheekily rubbing it on his shirt just to give Dark the finger. Not even planning to stick around for further black and white justice. Why tripe from the American? Izime. Constantinople, I've got a name from it. Stan threw his first big face card on the table, one he hoped wasn't a joker in disguise. Not quite willing to hope yet, even as Constantinople kept the line open. Does it happen ring any bells because it mentioned you by name, friend of yours? Call it an alternative amusement we've supplied beyond popping topside. Why bother coming here to spread fear and terror only to get their horns tossed back below when Izime can deliver it? Constantinople quickly stepped up, wanting to take control of any direction Dark Knight might be taking this immediately, as well as defend his drinking buddy. The bloke keeps my workload down, beyond the oddball demon relic or mummified what have you I call him for, and stop calling Izzy in it, bloody rude mate that. Constantinople gave a laugh as he considered Izime's range of stop, giving a nod towards the overprotective Dark Knight. Hell, next time you need something to give a Zexian a round of fisticuffs you should ask him. Wankers probably has a glowing green rock lying about someplace, might be at the ass end of the universe, but someplace. Any actual information? Stan narrowed his eyes, unwilling to reveal just how much Constantinople had just confirmed. This Izime was a massive threat, not only knowing his identity but having access to Zexianite. As long as the exorcist was still talkative, Stan was willing to try and force him back onto the floor. Constantinople scratching at the stubble on his cheeks as he considered just what tidbits of info to part with. Some things the caped crusader just didn't need to be worried about when it came to the knick-knack dealer. He showed up maybe 4 or 5 years ago. Bird showed shortly after your Zexian friend sent that invasion packing. So, say a year into the first rumors of the grey market, he found me, not seen hair or feather of either of the fuckers in 2 years. Constantinople tried to remember when he had started hearing about the oddity salesman, the king of knickknacks. Before adding a bit of his own private information he had collected while dealing with Izime in hell. The man gave Lucifer a double take, and the king of hell had requested a private talk, something Constantinople certainly hadn't allowed. Apparently cursed with knowledge of some sort according to my own sources, and not the fun kind. It didn't excite the demons, they were genuinely curious, and that was new to see. So, the exorcist shared the reason Lucifer had given for the request. They're a problem, Darksy. I thought you dealt with him. Stan watched as the computer finished transcribing the words, Constantinople own conclusions matching his dive as well, an entire nothingburg. 0 facts with the addition of some demonic superstitions? Stan's frown only deepened as he quickly hit the backspace, removing the annoying nickname from his archives. Deal, yes, talk and have a pint not so often as I'd like. Constantinople regretted he was adding that part. Izime was a pretty fun chap in the mix. Izime lived for business though, and that's how Constantinople had met him, so their friendship had stalled. If you'd met the man, you'd know you don't need to meet him, Dark. He delivers and collects as needed, literally as easy as snapping your fingers, mate, least for anyone stupid enough to try that spell of his. He knows our secret identities. Leaning forward to make sure Constantinople heard him clearly, Stan revealed what had pushed him to make the call. Revealing his final card and the issue he was going to settle regardless of Constantinople's easygoing nature, Stan wasn't going to be swayed by the con's mouth. Frankly, I need a countermeasure. That's a bugger, but, well, it's a you problem, mate. Like I said, he is cursed with knowing things, and that's not just some shite. Constantinople recalled the absolute zero surprise Izime had given any of their deal, acting like he'd seen more terror on a random Tuesday than in the depths of actual hell. I'd suggest trying to cut a deal bloody fast, like, so he doesn't get tempted to just pop in and clean you out quick, ha. Can you schedule a meeting? Stan took the joke as a warning, ever serious as he glanced at all the tech and gear around the dark cavern. The risk Izime was posing growing by the second in the sleuth's mind. The rude thing was using powers unknown by science to warp reality. It could avoid almost any security measure aside from very dedicated devices. Though Stan had slated to stop the man on the other end of the line. Not sure I want to, Dark. Izime's not hurting anyone, and frankly, YA sound a bit pissy. Constantinople leaned forward, hearing the threat in Dark Knight's tone, holding his own phone a bit steadier as he eyed the man and his growing number of sidekicks. Sides, they're a problem already standing right beside you. Izzy has few rules, but among the top? No psychics. They've talked already, in person. Stan gave the alien a tense look as the situation was currently her fault. If she'd just stopped the thing there, then none of this would have happened. She's the one he told about the toxin. Yeah? Didn't she get his number then? The alien in question looking down as the voice played, Constantinople raised brow, daring her to give an honest answer. Curious if he'd known Dark Knight would throw a fit or if Izime had just running his mouth to fill the time. The man was a chat box just like his bird. Still, Constantinople was having trouble believing he'd have a chinwag with the psychic of all people. He didn't look like he had a cell phone. Psyis looked back at the exorcist, not quite willing to hang the word homeless around Izime's neck, not wanting to insult the man. Izime's attitude not being so destitute but an altogether different odd kind of rough, Izime looked like was struggling a bit. So, you have met Izime? Constantinople raised his brows as Psyis revealed she had actually had a conversation with the man, making the connection between her words and Izime's usual outfits. Nodding, Constantinople agreed as Izime really often didn't, maybe if he'd scrounged a working one, but those were usually gone with a week tops or however long it took for Cradle to find it. Has probably got a handful of broken ones, that or his bird ate it. Aha! The exorcist slapped his thigh while thinking of that moody shit's bird devouring his phone, casting another look at the alien who had been looking aside. Obviously wanting to avoid demeaning the man, wondering exactly what it was that made the purple Thessian avoid just saying homeless. You really can't find him? The exorcist narrowed his eyes, not quite believing one of the most powerful psychics in the world couldn't find a single man. Had she really been looking for him and then just let him slip away? Now acting with what? A touch of respect, a sense of guilt, or something else? Izime had made Lucy blink, so leave it to him to mess with the psychic's head as well. Man had a knack for the impossible. I don't want to disturb this time, Stan interrupted Constantinople's focus on the alien, wanting to bring the conversation back to solving his own issue with the man. I want to schedule a meeting. Why? And I'll need something better than the tripe issue you've both got. Constantinople nodded towards the two humans. He did have a way, if Izime hadn't broken that damned magical mirror or fed it to his bird. Enchanting the damn thing to taste like chili pepper had cost him a few £1,000s, only to learn birds didn't even taste bloody capsaicin. I could sell him SOM. Stan nodded, taking out a small clipboard he had prepared, wanting to use his business empire to lure the man in. Glancing up as he heard a derisive snort, his intentions obviously falling short someplace. Dark, you run an actual business empire on Earth, what better deal can you offer besides free? Constantinople cut him off instead, knowing Izime's methods, as well as his constant stock of Dark's things. Besides, he's already got nobloid with stalls stocked full of your gear on some super Earth someplace, I promise. I actually wanted to apologize to Cradle. Psyis interrupted, wanting to earn a bit of her place back after messing up earlier. Thinking of the fight she had nearly caused in the noodle shop, I upset Izime's bond with my psychic probing. We started threatening one another. The stupid bird? Stephen looked over in dumbfounded shock at the alien, who sounded honestly worried about some not even real animal. Just a complicated imitation that was serving to interfere in the whole investigation, and she wanted to apologize to it for hurting its feelings. No, lad, that could actually work, and Cradle's hardly just a bird. Constantinople looked at Stephen and admonished him on Cradle's behalf. The two were a pair, and if the alien had started something with the raven, it was best to see the air cleared. Izime cares a great deal for that mechanical beast. Why? Enough that if it was upset and Miss Psyis genuinely wanted to make amends, he might just meet. Here's the rub though, you two would get spotted from bloody orbit, and that is the whole point of this call, Stan. Something that's already happened once today. Stan nodded, recalling how they had arrived to find Psyis floating over an empty alley. Smelling of spicy noodles and in street clothes, their target obviously giving the psychic the talk around before slipping away. I don't want to disturb this time, but I'm not completely opposed to it, Constantinople. I? Good luck with that, because Cradle eats technology and it's had Izime feeding it since he hatched the bloody thing. Constantinople didn't want to mention that some of that had likely been Blaine's. Instead, quickly moving this painful trolley of a conversation along, the alien's got a reason, so I'll help. She's had a cock up with the killer fucking Corbeau, pardon my French, Miss Psyis. You might want to resolve that issue quickly. Regular ravens carry grudges, let alone one that can empty your bank account with a thought. Things right terrifying in a real scrap. You two, stop getting bloody chop sky every time some wanker knows your names. Looking back to other two displayed on his smaller screen, he tried to bury the hatchet between the two parties on his own. Maybe Izime could cut him deal later for all the effort it'd likely take, though Constantinople doubted it. There are bloody 20 of us at least now. It doesn't make me comfortable adding another name to that list. Stan shook his head, refusing to accept that yet another person had slipped through after years of, well, not perfection, but damn it, he tried. Izime was already on it, you just didn't know he knew. Constantinople hoped he wasn't digging Izime a deeper hole with his next words, but it would at least give perspective. Knight, he knows James's identity too, knew me. Wanker probably knows the identities of a few of our enemies as well. Cursed, like I said, so we should all be very thankful Izime doesn't sell information, he sells stuff, of all kinds. Dark Knight actually felt himself be taken aback by this information. This man knew both James and his identities. Could access the Dark Cavern and had Zexionite? Stan, recalling his worries over the way it had seemed to be traveling and studying Earth's heroes, asked Constantinople just how this man had remained a ghost. Such a large threat to the entire planet, and he had slipped under nearly everyone's radar, the UN-cowled hero reconsidering the value of the information Psyis had obtained. Why am I just now learning of this individual, Constantinople? Dark Knight narrowed his eyes as the questions and worries only piled further, the gap in his monitoring network seeming to extend to what he knew. No one's mentioned him or known him aside from you. Even if Constantinople was right, just why none of the crooks he had dropped never mentioned the man's name? If he was so well established in the black market and held such a high reputation, why had neither Skullshot, Swordstroke, or any of the other mercenaries mentioned the man? You don't ever buy used, knight. All your gear is new and self-made, so why would you know the name of the man who built the second-hand market? And Earth isn't that big on welcoming the oddity of his sales. Constantinople tried to explain, realizing Stan was stuck in his own world as usual, where everything was seen in two ways. There was legal and not, the acceptable stores and the black markets in Stan's mind. Even knowing the exorcist, he still refused to believe in magic, the sheer balls on the man. Black markets, you know, sure, but Izime isn't selling guns or supplying Crusher with off-world synthroids. It's all in a grey area: batteries, high-flow air cycling units, Zexian storage crystals, and sure, maybe a few odder things, but certainly not actual weapons or bombs, mate. Stan Blaine sat back a bit, realizing there may be a much larger gap in his information network than he originally believed. The possibility of an intermediary market where the lines of what was strictly legal were being blurred purposefully. Either by reselling in different locals or modifying dangerous devices to serve a different purpose. The entire market supplied off the back of the Earth's own chaos and funding who knew what. Like a fear-inducing drug to an exorcist that's invested in keeping demons occupied in hell. Right then, ye have gotten us. Take us both to the constable's darksea, but wait, it's not illegal there, and it's doing me a mite bit of bloody good here. Constantinople finally relaxed as well, waving away the last of his worries with sarcasm. Stan was finally getting the point. The justice-driven man saw everything as a threat at first, and in very black and white terms. Not exactly the kind of person you wanted your drug dealer for demons to meet up with. Thankfully, it seemed that Stan was at least willing to stand down with the hard-edged Dark Knight mentality, at least before they were trying to figure out which Reaver pub Stephen had been dumped in. What if I wanted to buy something? Stan wasn't quite willing to let it drop, instead switching gears. He at least needed to see this Izime, meet the man that had been silently picking up his excess and making a living off of it. Unsure if he was impressed, still angry, or both, but positive he still didn't trust the man. Now that I might be able to work out. Constantinople stood, quickly deciding to intervene. Dark Knight wasn't going to let this go, and that meant Izime needed someone to vouch for him. Give me an hour and I'll be there. You're coming here? Stan looked back at the screen, a bit surprised to see Constantinople already opening a cabinet and pulling out a container of salt. Not seen the fucker in over a year. I should say hi at least. Constantinople tore the box open, looking towards the floor where the couch was still in the way. Proper teleportation spells were a bit more complex than his friend's hack job, bit larger too. The magical mirror of annoyance ... Izime zoomed in a bit further, the tiny bit on the driver finally seating into the screw that needed removed. All of his attention on the small box he was trying to reassemble, several coils of steel cable lying on the ground beside him. Izime carefully removing the case from the cable thrower before examining the uncoiled spring inside. Izime still wasn't quite sure what the stuff was made of, but it held up a load of kinetic energy, enough to toss these cables lightning fast a pretty damned good distance. This issue was the material was also tended to become incredibly brittle after use, maybe 1 in 5 spent throwers having a compromised spring. Either they ruined themselves as their curves warped from the wasted thermal energy as potential became kinetic, or retained their forms, just becoming incredibly brittle. The spring's material behaving like a ceramic after deploying itself, cracking and shattering as it was reset. Taking another tool with a series of interlocking circles, Izime set it to the proper size, slowly cranking the spring back down. Listening for any signs of the brittle metal giving up the ghost, waiting for that telltale pop that signaled a failure. Smiling when the final ring slid into place, returning the spring to its original state, fully charged with potential. Reaching down, he retrieved one of the cables he had rolled up and prepared earlier. Slipping it back into its chamber, ready to be relaunched by the trap. Giving the spring-loading tool a smack on the top, watching as the circles snapped back. Releasing the spring, which quickly caught on the cable, ready and armed, giving a nod, Izime reached over, preparing to grab the top of the tiny trap, ready for its final reassembly. The process only a few steps, but taking nearly an hour just to ensure the spring was managed safely and he wasn't asking Cradle to free him from a sprung trap or worse. Izime had the screw halfway back in when he heard the noise, glancing up at the bird he had just been thinking about as voices started to creep around the room. The sounds reaching out from the box of junk that sat on the shelf, the idle chatter filling the concrete room quickly. The raven glancing at him before they both looked over at the box where Izime was storing most of the junk items like cell phone batteries and spare magazines. Somewhere in there was a familiar voice calling out alongside some unknowns asking questions. Izime ignored the sounds coming from the box as he tipped it over, watching as a small wave of crap was spilled out onto the shelf. Moving a few power bricks and a couple other off-world baubles, Izime finally located the noisy thing. Oi! Izzy! Hey! Is it there? Hi, oh no one? Are you sure this will work? Just hold on a bloody damned minute. Were we in a toolbox? Wait, we're moving. Wanker kept me in the bin. I'm not hearing anything but breathing. Izzy. Ori. You twat. Cradle. Hello? Someone just sat us down. Is it there? Was that a bird? Izzy, that you, mate? Grabbing the handle of the very intricately carved silver mirror, Izime was careful to hold it towards the ceiling while listening to the voices that were coming through the reflection. Two of the voices he recognized, one was his old drinking buddy, the other he had just talked to today. The mysterious male voice sounded familiar, but not enough that Izime could place it off those few words. Yeah, give me a minute so I can clear you a spot, Constantinople. Izime knocked a few of the traps onto the ground, clearing a spot on the table a little distance away from himself. Carefully to make sure he was abusing the mirror's magical viewing portal, angling himself so he could check the surrounding behind the actual people while offering them a view of the soar's ceiling. What do you need, Jim? Izime looked over at the silvery reflection that cast a view into another underground room. Unlike his soars, this was a cavern heavily modified. Dark nights, obviously, there were only so many heroes who had that kind of budget to blow on lighting. Izime quickly gesturing for Cradle to come and watch the mirror, the raven's curiosity enough to block any real view. Hey, Izzy? Ah, there's Cradle. Constantinople on the other end tilted his mirror trying to see anything beyond a concrete ceiling, the exorcist just barely able to see his friend if he held the mirror sideways. Finally, a black feathered head and black beak appeared looking down at them. Constantinople righted the mirror and asked the two, how's Voltum treating you this time of year? Profitably, Izime kept idly working on reassembling the cable thrower in front of his while he talked, the dangerous part now over. He was willing to multitask. Casually glancing over, he called the exorcist out, wanting to avoid any attempts at getting played, but I don't think you're calling for another 10,000-year-old eye. No, actually, I've got a client for you, mate. Filthy rich too, you'll love em, bruv. Constantinople smiled, nodding enthusiastically, knowing already it wouldn't be nearly so easy. Hoping, however, that a quick move on the chessboard towards Izime's wallet would ease the rest of the game he was about to play. Really now, Izime actually stopped working to seriously take a look at Jim. Constantinople's cheeky smile as the mirror lay face up on the table. Giving a long look at the surroundings behind the often inebriated exorcist and making a few assumptions as to his location, not a far reach considering Izime's company for lunch. They wouldn't happen to own that dark cavern you're in and run a business empire of under the name Blaine, would they? Just happened to be trying out Spelunker, sod it. Constantinople started to make an excuse before tossing the idea away, knowing it was best to play it straight with the dealer of trinkets. Yeah, I'm at Dark Nights. What do you think of the place? Holding the mirror a bit further away from his face, Constantinople gave a little walk around, ignoring Stan's complaints. If Izime wanted in, there wasn't a whole lot Stan could do. Maybe he could lock Jenkins in the basement with a shotgun. Even that was only a deterrent and not a solution. Constantinople watching as Izime gave an appreciative nod from the corner of the mirror. Dark, like I said, those spotlights have got to stress the eyes. Izime gave an honest appraisal of the cavern, which was shown while Constantinople did a little spin with the mirror on his end. What does Stan want? To talk about how you know his secret identity, obviously. Constantinople deadpanned at the obvious issue, knowing Izime wasn't an idiot and just wanted to make sure Stan was clear about his major problem. I do not trade information, that goes double for my own Jim. Izime shook his head at first before giving a bit of an accommodating nod, knowing that this wouldn't be dropped so easily. It was obvious this talk was going to take place at some point. Izime had just hoped to last a little longer before being caught. Put Blaine on. Stan Blaine, an extended family. I'm Izime and I too am underground. Izime rolled his eyes as the joke went by without making a single wave, instead diving into the main point of his speech. I exist as the grey market, so first I thank you for the contributions you've made to my sales. Before we waste each other's time, I'm sure you have questions that I won't be answering. My market is something that can't be maintained without a bit of secret ash. Honor among thieves, really? Stan crossed his arms, biceps bulging as he tried to crush the oft-heard excuse. Irate that the reputable salesman was being so disingenuous, calling Izime out on his behavior. I thought we weren't wasting each other's time. The cowled crusader glaring at the man on the other side of the mirror who seemed to be unbothered, an attitude that Dark Knight too no small satisfaction in correcting in his other villains. However, Stan was surprised to find that Izime wasn't as taken back as Stan had expected, instead the man's voice coming back with an air of annoyance rather than surprise. No thieves here, just a scavenger. I'm an upcycler unlike your reformed sticky-pawed kitten. Izime decided to play a bit of hardball with Dark Knight, exposing more personal information before detailing the finer parts of the sales. Your climbing equipment is being sold on high-G tourist worlds, the rest mostly gets smelted down. The metal sold on rundown and repurposed generation ships where quality metal is a must for life. Any remaining silicon is processed by my bond Cradle. Cradle say thank you. Constantinople was happy the bird only bobbed its head, the veins on Stan Blaine's head could only protrude so far. Izime pressing on to only irritate the gloomy and shadowy crusader further as he tossed any of the Blaine's concerns aside. If you've got an issue then you should start picking up after yourself, thankfully we know that's impossible. For both you and your adversaries, Izime chuckled as he considered the sight of Dark Knight and villains both cleaning up their mess like children done at play. Izime gave a shake of his head at the absurd thought as he continued. So, I will be keeping my shop open regardless of your willingness to be involved. In that same vein of blatant self-interest, you can rest assured I won't be revealing anything about anyone to anyone. Ever, simply put, I don't stock information on others because it keeps my batteries profitable. I don't trust you. Stan admitted the major issue, unable to completely refute Izime at this exact moment, several countermeasures already in mind. Though the thought of a degrading core did raise the issue of what might happen if Izime wasn't checking those products. You don't trust anyone, Stan, that's why you have a counter for every major player from Radiation Man to Fazpaz. Which I also know, so if me simply knowing your name is what's got you worried. Izime waved his hand futility as Dark Knight was a figure he knew he could never fully satisfy. I obviously know a lot more than just that. It's not like I made any conscious effort to uncover your secret anyway, I just know things as Constantinople should have told you already. Constantinople took that as his cue to end the eye-poking, Stan fists already audibly popping behind him as he dealt with the information. Dealing with it the only way Dark Knight knew how, bottling it up and becoming thrice as gloomy and broody. The Exorcist hoping he could get Izime to play some kind of ball with the group of heroes that had taken an exception to his little side shop. At least a face-to-face between the man who could rile up League Savior and the man who had managed to not rile the unknown galaxy. Told ye, Dark. Oye Izime, I've also got a lady here who would like to make amends to Cradle. Constantinople tried to pull the conversation back towards a potential meetup instead of a potential war in Voltum. Psyis wants to apologize, in person. Now panning the mirror towards the psychic, a feeble wave accompanying her inviting smile. The other half of the dark duo giving her a reproachful glance while Constantinople raised his brows expectantly towards Izime. The Exorcist refusing to move from beside Psyis, brining both himself and the mirror into the alien's face. Izime watching as Psyis tried to hold that smile while giving the blonde Brit a sideways glance, obviously a bit uncomfortable with the sudden closeness. I told Psyis where she could find me outside of work, we can meet up in a few months if it's still bugging her. Izime gave Cradle a look, watching for any negative reaction to the psychic's name, or the view of her in the mirror. Ravens could certainly hold a grudge after all, Izime not wanting to upset either side. If she still wants to apologize to Cradle by then, bring some snack sticks. RAM or any computer memory, it's the current favorite. Constantinople let his brows drop, giving the alien a bit of a shove as he walked away. The woman had obviously left him hanging. For being able to fly, she was a terrible wing alien when it came to convincing the solitary Izime to come out and play for a bit. The Exorcist scratching at his stubble, instead deciding he may as well try and just ask honestly. Mate, I ain't seen you in a couple years. Constantinople turned the mirror away from the psychic, finally asking directly if he could at least meet, maybe catch a show at the very least. Izime being nothing but work, there was a chance he'd be pulling a shift at this second job. Are you playing Voltum? I wasn't planning on it, the clubs here are rough and the bars are woe dash dot. Izime shook his head as he considered Constantinople's offer of going out for a brief moment. The small-time busker already imagining the bottle smashing against the wire protection in front of some back alley watering ditch. Hearing a derisive snort, however, Izime looked up, finding that Constantinople shared none of those same worries. I know the man who started a brawl in a Reaver joint isn't complaining about the Voltum social scene. Constantinople cut Izime off directly, not believing the excuse for a second. A pint, just the one, come on matey chap, yeah? I'm not exactly dressed for a night out on Earth, Constantinople. Izime paused as he considered the tanks of fear toxin and the fact he really hadn't hung out with his friend in about a year, maybe longer. It'd be a gift of sorts, not free by any means, but if Constantinople wanted to drink Izime con the con. Meet me at that grimy-ass bar on 32nd and bring some chalk. I've got 4 tanks full of toxin stashed away for you anyway. You're a saint, I'll vouch for it myself after that little bang up in the 6th circle. Constantinople beamed, holding the mirror a bit further back so he could pull out the magical tool, still a right ass at the same time as he. I love YA though. We'll be there and Dark Knight promises to behave. Give me an hour to find a shower, clean up and then I'll be there. I've got to hit a shelter first. Izime looked at the pile of traps. He had barely made any progress on, feeling as if he'd never finished them. Procrastination wasn't exactly what he was doing, however, Izime excusing his laziness for the same of so-called networking. The Raven's Basilisk. Chapter 12. A night at Lucky Dog's. It was a bit over an hour later when the group finally met in the Voltum underbelly. The heavily layers of overpasses and raised highways above the densely packed slums adding to the distinct Voltum near dystopian vibe. Thick reinforced concrete pillars supported with massive steel beams split the rising steam with their shadows. Both methods of support and the undersides of the overpasses covered in graffiti as far as a body could conceivably reach. Below, tucked into the dense cluster of buildings, was a tucked-away little dive, a sheet metal awning over the solid door, a single flashing neon hung along the brick wall. It showcased a rather gruff-looking bulldog, the cards in its paw slowly lighting up to reveal a near-royal flush in hearts. The 2 of hearts would flicker briefly before switching to the ace of hearts, the new card completing the royal flush and earning the dive its name, Lucky Dogs. Constantinople looked up at the club sign as he leaned against the once frequented old haunt, the trio of heroes standing in a little cluster beside him. Glancing down the darkening street to see their fifth walking up for the night. Izime looking much more civilized by Earth standards than he usually was, Constantinople a bit surprised by the apparent effort his friend had put in. That one of the executioner's old jackets, it's missing the skull. Raising his brows, Constantinople gave a nod, inquiring about the new leather jacket Izime was wearing. Izime glanced down at the leather jacket he was wearing, trying to recall exactly who it had belonged to. There were a bunch of holes and patches where he had removed a totally unreasonable number of spikes, and it smelled like smoke. It was one of the Soul Takers, don't remember if it was Timmy Barr's or Elliot's though. Izime finally recalled the anti-hero the jacket had belonged to. The soul-taking demon contracted flaming bike rider Soul Taker, that or his horse-riding predecessor. The thing had nearly been shredded when Izime found it, but it was leather, so it just needed a bunch of patches. Sure, it didn't look great, but it was functional, protective, and conveniently enough completely fireproof. The black also went with nearly any of the other clothes Izime had scrounged up, like the light brown shirt and naturally distressed jeans he had on. The denim fading and fraying from actual use and not some fancy machine. Jim stood across from Izime, the classic tan jacket one of Constantinople Constance along with the worn-looking slacks. Beside him on the right were the two Blaines, surprisingly having managed to dress down somewhat. Izime wasn't too surprised Stan had some old clothes, but Stephen was still towing the line showing his money. The plated biker jacket he was wearing might have been scuffed, but it was still too showy, and those jeans were obviously mock designer. Stan had managed to put together something decent, but that wasn't all that surprising. The aged and patched grey blazer and plain white shirt managed to make the man look like he had lost millions. The jeans were still Jenkins level pleated though. Izime wasn't going to start docking points. This wasn't a mission, it was a networking and a bit of catching up with Constantinople, so Psyis had it spot on at least. The same stained grey hoodie and cheap denim that had him convinced the alien was just the average Volthamite. Though the bit of white hair that was spilling alongside her head stood out a bit, Izime supposed she couldn't help her natural hair colour. It was probably a bit difficult to keep it so pristine and snow-white, thought. Cradle is? Psyis asked a bit nervously, not wanting to psychically start checking her surroundings and wind up upsetting the Raven again. A bit worried as Izime's gaze had lingered on her for a moment, eye searching her as if suspicious. Cradle's above Miss Psyis. Izime put thoughts about aliens and hair dye aside, giving a nod skyward before looking at the unwanted company for tonight. No offense, Mr. Blaine, but I don't trust you either. Cradle will be keeping an eye on things for me. That is a smart move. Blaine didn't feel much emotional sway from the man who had addressed him by name in Voltam's underground. Obviously, he was confident, but both of them were, so Blaine simply acknowledged the move. Oh. A quiet voice of slightly surprised disappointment slipped through the cracks in the conversation as Izime continued, accidentally speaking over Psyis' disheartened sigh. I don't mind you, all of you checking your surroundings as well. Izime shrugged, perfectly willing to share the field with all but one, giving the alien a bit of a limitation. Just keep it under 70,000 feet, Miss Psyis, and out of my own mind. Drink first and magic later? Constantinople gave an appreciative nod as the group seemed to be coming to terms for their first meeting. At least setting some ground rules around baser powers and personal security. Yeah. No. Two spoke over two more, Blaine and Izime still giving one another the odd look while Psyis glanced at Stephen in irritation. Stephen crossing his arms as he stepped closer to his mentor, wanting to try and physically impose with their size. Breaking his contact with those red eyes as he joined in, trying to intimidate Izime into listening. Constantinople just glanced between both pairs in frustration until Izime finally explaining his reasoning. I can't transport for people, and let be clear, Stan, you were never invited to the deal. Izime waved his fingers as he considered exactly where he had stashed the tanks. It would be a pain to hide all over again. Giving Blaine a welcoming nod towards the door, he did invite the man along in some fashion. You are welcome to drink though. We didn't plan on drinking anyway. Blaine shook his head, not wanting to partake in any sort of social life that Constantinople enjoyed. Already wary of the place they had arrived, it being a well-known locale for ne'er-do-wells of both human and the not-so-human variety, Constantinople will take us. Sorry, Constantinople sighed, stuffing his hands into his tan jacket pockets, giving a nod back towards the dark duo in waiting, Stan still wanting to even the field. Okay, let's be clear, Constantinople doesn't even know where to go, so unless I'm willing to comply to this search, to which I'm not, then you've got no real play here. My advice is to look me up on Savior Orbital instead of interrupting my night, Stan. Izime nodded, giving Blaine a look as he offered up his soul information. If Blaine wanted anything, he could have his business contact info, so Izime directed him there. Any one of you can look me up in the Zythomian databases and find me in the Vidan's expense reports. My soul ID is public and I'm not using an alias, so start with that, not with this shitty attempt at strong-arming me. Now drinks. Izime jerked his thumb towards the door, not intending to waste any more of his life on explaining pointless details to Stan or Stephen. Blaine, hell, any of the three. Sighing, Izime asked the first question one should ask when drinking with the exorcist, focusing on protecting his wallet. Who's buying? Izime moved past the obviously pissed Stan Blaine, who was glaring at him, towards the entrance, leaving that square jaw grinding away. Stan likely considering if following Izime's advice was rolling over or the wiser move. Seeing as Constantinople had led them to Lucky Dog's door rather uselessly, the sleuth's options were limited unless he wanted to cause a scene. Who's got more money, you or Stan? Constantinople asked a genuine question as he looked between two of the richest people he knew, turning to follow his friend, who decided to try and seemingly succeeded in putting Dark Knight in his place. Izime's churlish attitude likely earning him a full-blown investigation from the Blaines. The exorcist followed along, knowing Izime would need someone in his corner. Bringing up an idle thought the exorcist had suddenly become curious enough to inquire about. Stan had stocks, cash, earth credit, and untold sums saved away. Izime had shells piled with gems, trinkets from a millennia ago, and more soul accounts that Cradle had feathers. More than likely that was. The exorcist never getting a solid figure from either of them, now using Izime bit of ire to tempt him into answering. If it's not earth money, then it's me. If it's earth money? Izime admitted the first part easily, scratching the back of his head as he considered honestly answering the second half. With the help of Cradle, he probably could launder enough credits to give Blaine an honest run for his money before the Vidan financial division showed. Also you? Constantinople figured what Izime was considering, not being nearly as morally strict as the other heroes around him. The trinket trader could probably easily launder those untold credits into earth money and cheat his way into being richer than Stan Blaine in seconds. Right now? Probably, seeing as I still have Cradle's debit card. Izime admitted as he pulled the black and silver stripped card out of his pocket. We're easily in the top 100 for Orion's arm alone, but I can't in good conscience collapse Earth's economy just because. The Vidan Security Council would have me arrested within the hour for interfering with a civilized world on such a scale. And how much is it worth if you don't launder it all into an established economy? Constantinople stuffed his hands in his pockets, calling his toxin dealer out on being a liar. Izime son the filthy rich, because he'll trade in some long-forgotten currency that's good on exactly 2 half-star-burnt generation ships tough en off near the ass end of the stars. The one man who'll crawl back across the stars and throw a fit if the Vidan doesn't acknowledge them because of some treaty that's half dust already. None of those agreements extending to Earth, of course, so my soul credits stay off Earth unless I'm short. Izime stuffed the card back into his pocket, glaring at the exorcist before his gaze swept the 3 morally stricter heroes. Speaking of Constantinople, I'd rather not commit money laundering in front of our friends tonight, so how about you pay on time for once? Mate, you know, it's been a bit rough lately. Constantinople smiled, throwing an arm over Izime's shoulder, dragging him down a bit as he waved his free hand in question. A hopeful smile crossing the exorcist's face, a few brightly colored stones appeared in his palm, which he opened in question. Do you still take gems? Pay at least half in cash now, and I'll cut you a deal. Izime looked at his friend and business partner with a plaintive expression, a bit ashamed to admit he really did need the money, even offering to give a steep discount. I'll do gems for the rest later. For tanks is a bit much, mate. Constantinople released Izime, knowing that his friend wasn't asking for money just because. It was likely he didn't have Earth cash and was seriously considering the risks with the Galactic Economic Finance Police. Agreed, it was a sudden windfall after all, so I can manage storage for free, but I need at least 1,000 for one tonight or I'm dumping the lot into the sun. Izime rocked his head back and forth as he considered his expected expenses for the next little while, adding an additional warning for the exorcist to keep in mind. Considering the sudden attention I've gained in Voltum, who knows when I'll get more. Fucking wanker, Constantinople whipped a hand out of his jacket, smacking Izime on the arm as the man had no sense of style, no art of the trade. Simply playing hardball from the get-go and delivering an ultimatum within seconds. I'll be back, I'm going to find an A.T. dash. Thank you and done. Izime threw his arm around the exorcist, now giving him a friendly shake in return for the smack. Cradle even saved you and acknowledged the conversion rates for the US dollar. Still a bloody thieving budgie, fine, let's go. Constantinople cursed towards the black credit demon in the sky, looking at the Blaines accusingly as the trip suddenly got a bit expensive. Only one Tedto drink now, I'm needing one. At least it's in Earth gravity this time, puking in low G is fun, right? Izime wanted to at least cheer Constantinople up a bit after Cradle had helped themselves to his wallet. Don't. Stop it. Constantinople paled a bit as he recalled the sensation, the mess, the smell that had lingered in the ship's vents for days, even recalling how he'd had to dodge the still floating puddles. No, I don't want to remember. Huh? Izime laughed, pointing at the psychic seemed to have unfortunately just caught the recalled memory from Constantinople, watching as she paled to a sky blue and lavender, one hand covering her mouth. Come on, let's get this over with. Izime stepped between the 4, pulling the door open, wanting to at least hurry this so-called leisure time along so he could get back to the cable throwers in the sewer across Voltum. Jess is just going to love this. Nah, she'll have let it go, right? Constantinople considered Izime's warning before turning back towards other 3 tag-alongs who'd immediately leaned away from the blasting music inside. Guess this is your first dive with Izzy, plug your ears and welcome to Lucky Dog. The three exchanged a glance, watching as Constantinople took out two bright orange foam buds, rolling them about before tucking them into his ears. The trench-coated exorcist quickly disappearing inside, the street being blasted with the volume of the club as the door swung open once again. Psyis used her powers to slightly dampen the movement of the air around her ears, creating a form of invisible earmuffs. Watching as both Stan and Steven took out their own actual earplugs, the tiny flashing lights told of many untold features. Moving between the two, who she could sense were busy thinking of ways to uncover more information about Izime, Psyis pulled the door open, walking through a narrow hallway that turned into a reception area for checking IDs. A curvaceous woman behind the counter. Izime throwing his arms open as he saw the ironically named and shaped woman who happened to run the bar. Sometimes wondering if she had a bit of succubus in her past, as there was no way that figure was naturally possible. The woman looking like a real-life version of a certain voluptuous redhead with the last name Rabbit from another world's cartoon imagination. "There's my favorite bunny." Izime looked at the curtain of red hair that was at the entrance to the skeevy haunt-turned-bar. The otherworldly scavenger a bit taken back as the club's owner immediately shoved a card reader towards him upon hearing his request. "Let me get a table downstairs for 5. "Not a fucking rabbit, Izime, and not till you pay your tab. "You'd better keep that fucking bird out of my bar too. That thing ate the stage lights last time after you nearly killed Dash." Jessie stood slamming her hand on the counter, already raising her voice, trailing off as she saw the second person join. Mouth open as she exhaled in exasperation, she looked at Izime's +1 for the night. "Constantinople? I swear to the gods if you're both here to start shit with another demon. Just keep your patrons from pulling axes, Jess, and you bloody well know they started it with us." Constantinople quickly reached past Izime and swiped his card through the reader, pulling Izime along with him before he could piss Jessie off more. "Now you owe me one, Izzy." Izime shoved the exorcist along with a pat on the back, ignoring the cheeky con magician who thought clearing such a minor expense was going to earn him any further deals. Turning back to see who'd caught Jess's eye as the easily fired-up woman ignored them, letting Constantinople go ahead of him for a moment. "And you are?" Jessie at least tried to keep some semblance of a professional attitude as another patron soon walked in. Cursing under her breath, swearing trouble came in threes, and Izime had asked for her to seat 5. Brushing her long red hair out of her face, she took a look. At least this one looked a bit more manageable. "She's with us and so are the two behind her." Constantinople spoke up as Jessica began to question the others, not wanting her to start digging too far into the situation. The exorcist quickly waving the psychic to follow them, only to be stopped by Jess's already over it attitude as she held her hand out expectantly. "And? I still want to see some ID, demonic, human, or otherwise, mister. My bar has rules." Jessica rolled her eyes, leaning over the counter with her hand out, motioning for the newest to hand over some ID quickly. "I'm an otherwise." Psyis pulled out her own Centropolis ID and handed it over, watching as Jessica's shapely mouth closed and her eyebrows raised. Psyis explained her species quickly. "Alien. Not the first I've had to kick out, so you mind your shit too." Jessie rolled her eyes before reading, quickly handing back the Centropolis heroine's card. "Nope, no managing this one either." Jessie unabashedly writing the Centropolis angel in as the designated responsible party for tonight. "No tentacles or egg laying in my establishment, got it? I don't give two shits how consensual it is." Hopefully if there was any damage done, maybe she could sue Centropolis for the damages. Their hero was here. Only hoping, seeing as prayer would likely be useless, Constantinople was here after all. At least one of the multiple insurance coverage she had through various realms should cover something, right? Jessie already imagining the possible damages caused by the three that had just booked a table tonight. Psyis pocketing the card back, giving the Izime who had just abandoned her to this hazing a sarcastic look. The two having tarnished her reputation by association alone, the heroine curious what the actual club the two notorious idiots frequented was like. Hoping her hood would at least keep any of more the prying eyes in the bar at bay, it was bad enough to be famous, let alone to be seen with the apparently infamous two that were now holding the second door to the club interior open, patiently waiting to baptize her in its noise. Pausing for half a second as the actual entrance swinging open with a rush of chilly air, it was just Steven. Psyis ignoring the overly jealous thoughts around Stan's constant partner as she continued, making her way to follow the other two as Steven checked in his own faked ID. The alien taking a half step before she was stopped, looking down to see a familiar hand on her arm. She looked up a bit irked, but mostly with question in her eyes as Steven seemed to have other intentions beyond joining them. "Hey, you know Constantinople's helping Izime give us the runaround, right?" Steven entered and quickly snatched Psyis' arm, relaying his mentor's intentions on investigating Izime. "We're going to go to the station and check the database. You should come with me so we can get some real answers. You're useless here with your powers not working." Izime looked back as he heard the dark duo's intentions, not bothered at all that the two were willing to get out of his hair. Going out with Constantinople had at least motivated him to hit a shelter and clean up a bit. Earthlings not taking as kindly to his style of living as the Reaver colonies or the derelict ships he visited. Izime at least appreciated the kick in the ass and the invite to rejoin a bit of human culture outside of Wesson's family. Glancing at Psyis, her red eyes more focused on Steven's hand than the offer to escape her official baptism at Lucky Dogs. A bit curious if the alien would remember her reason for coming, her supposed reason that was. Izime hadn't raised the issue afterwards, not wanting to make the bird feel any kind of anticipation or anxiety, and Cradle hadn't asked. It was her own offer to apologize so the two could work out some agreement on using their powers. Psyis glanced up from where Stephen was holding her back, familiarity fighting intention. Red eyes turning towards the exorcist and human she had come to spend time with before looking back at her fellow hero. Unsure of which way to go, turning away once more as a voice came from the club's interior. Unhand the psychic, lad. Looking up from her arm to see Constantinople walking towards her, his hand out in offer, giving Stephen a bit of look before waggling his eyebrows at her. You're stealing the one chance I get to bend this bastard's rules. Izime watching the exorcist, his brows wiggling as his eyes belied the humor on his face. It wasn't that big of a deal, Izime just didn't want some mind reader constantly testing his defenses anyway. Psyis had already had it out with Cradle, even Izime had said his piece as her methods were rude by even his standards. Still, Cradle's calling her touch-petting didn't seem or sound like she had been trying to brute force their mental connection, so Izime was fine with her tagging along. Maybe she had learned her lesson over it, so things should be fine, it was just as easy not to bother at all, right? A bit unsure, Psyis could read that Constantinople really did want her to come to bother Izime, which worried her. Looking towards the man who had his brown hair tied back as he leaned against the door holding it open. His face unbothered beyond the look at Constantinople, wishing once again that she could read Izime's mind just as easily. The protective feeling from Stephen doubling down as Constantinople reached them, eyes still on Izime searching for a hint. Not a chance to pass up, but it's your choice of course. The exorcist addressing Psyis directly this time, offering her something Stephen hadn't, a choice. Psyis glanced at the thoughts under the frock of blonde hair one more time, double-checking just to be sure that Constantinople was offering her an out while getting a chance to irk his friend. Finding nothing truly sinister. With one final glance at Izime, who finally offered her a half-hearted smile and shrug in invite, Psyis made a decision. It was enough for her to bother tagging along for a bit. If it was a problem, she could just fly to the station. Pulling away from Stephen with a half-sorry look, Psyis was surprised at how easily he'd released her. Slipping past Constantinople quickly to try and catch the door Izime had just left to swing close on her after his maybe yes of an answer. Stephen reached out as the Psyis gave a pitiful smile and walked into the dimly lit hall following Izime. A bit sad but not quite upset, as he knew stopping her as her was impossible, Thessian's strength far outmatching his own. Stephen tried to follow his ex at the very least, moving towards the interior only to find the exorcist once again stopping him from keeping Psyis safe. Sorry lad, need a bit of help cracking this one from the lass. Besides, she's free and you've got plans, right? Constantinople quickly put a hand on the young man's chest, stopping him with a bit he had prepared. Banking on Stephen biting a tail about wanting to use the psychic against Izime and that for some reason he couldn't be there. Besides, dear adoptive dad Stan had already set the lad's schedule for the evening, Constantinople using the leash Dark Knight had on his partner to drive him away. Buying the two behind him a bit more time to separate themselves from the gloomy cloud that the Blaine seemed to enjoy spreading around everywhere. The exorcist listening while he layered on the bull, until finally the music's volume dropped. Constantinople smiled as the door behind him closing fully and sealing out at least a handful of decibels, confident the psychic could catch up with the alien-esque human. Psyis following that figure through the smoky hall as the pounding bass and racket finally began to clear into something sensible through the layers of sound dampening. The low notes reaching through the wall to vibrate the air around them already, the warbling highs clearing as she reached a balcony, speeding up to try and catch Izime. Wanting to at least ask the question directly, seeing as she couldn't read his mind. Red eyes cautiously glanced up from her clean tennis shoes as she tried to outmatch the pace of the slightly scuffed boots in front of her. Psyis a bit embarrassed as she noticed the bluing of her hand as it reached out to snag the elbow of Izime's jacket as she got close. The hell was she scared of? Izime walked down the hall which opened into the broad hall of the familiar club, smoke from the stage's machines mingled with that of patrons and drifted upwards towards the balcony he was walking across. Below, a mesh of musical forms was taking place nearly as complex and varied as the club's own patrons. Electronic notes and bone-rattling bass reaching out of a tinkin of a guitar, the vocalists fighting against the entire wall of noise that was supposedly backing them. Nearly reaching the very stained carpeted stairs before he felt a tug on his jacket, turning to see a blue and purple stripped hand pinching the leather. What? Izime stepped back towards the alien, trying not to bump into her as he leaned his ear towards her mouth. The club's music was bordering on painfully loud. The music was good certainly, but Lucky Dogs was not the place for casual conversation. Private certainly, but an easy relaxed chat was rather difficult here on the narrow balcony. I'm not being a bother, am I? Psyis tried to think of a reason for her tagging along with the two, finally using the same excuse Izime had put on hold originally. I wanted to apologize to Cradle, not interfere with your deal with Constantinople. Izime couldn't hold back the snort as he watched the world best psychic actually getting nervous because she didn't know how someone felt. The irony of the alien having such a terribly human flaw was really putting a crack in the image he had of her. quickly drawing his own conclusions as to why the exorcist had separated the psychic from her love interest in this world, even insisted on causing trouble for him. Izime had seen Constantinople pull more than one odd creature to tag along with them, though normally the man stuck to things less human-shaped. Nearly as bad as Belle had been pushing him to be intimate, though Constantinople claimed it was to celebrate life, not out of curiosity over how Izime might perform. "Why are you laughing?" Psyis let go of his jacket finally and crossed her arms, a bit cross that everything she said Izime somehow found humorous. It was just a question, and an honest one, not a joke or something silly. At least according to Constantinople, the exorcist was supposed to be the one bugging Izime, Psyis merely wanting to make sure she wasn't interfering. Nothing. Izime decided to actually give the alien a slight bump on the shoulder, at least trying to cheer her up before pointing back down the empty hall to explain, "It's fine, Constantinople's just being a prick to me and Stephen, because it's what he does. Don't take it personally, okay?" Izime paused as he realized that had just left him to explain exactly what it was Constantinople did when he managed to get Izime to go out on the town. First, it was that underwater bar trawl in Atlantis. AO drunk Izime was left unable to walk, trying to doggy paddle away from that eel thing instead. Constantinople having given the Hurrit them the key to his room, but or they had just fried the door lock with their 10k volts of enthusiasm. Then there was the time with that manta lobster thing. Izime had been beyond mortified watching as a 7-foot-tall soft-shelled crustacean cried. Constantinople even blamed him, saying that was supposed to only be a therapeutic massage and he never should have led the poor lady on. Izime had to finally sit the man down, explaining that despite Constantinople's best efforts, Izime did not share a similar enthusiasm for aquatic animals. The audacity of said statement had led to multiple assassins being sent after Izime's innocence, tonight possibly the boldest made by the exorcist. A blush spreading across Izime's cheeks as he looked at the alien, celebrity, superhero, very thankful and somehow very regretful that she couldn't just read his mind. The question in her eyes reaching her brows and slowly working its way towards the lightly silvered lips. Izime swallowing as he tried to think of a way to avoid the coming question. Their third apparently having somehow heard him a moment ago, speaking up to question him. Constantinople's voice startling Izime, who immediately looked up with a mixture of both irritation and blame. "What do I do?" Constantinople tried to keep his own smile still shit-eating and not as genuinely tense as Izime's was, watching as the two quickly separated as soon as his voice reached the two. Both had their own abilities to dampen noise and filter it. Izime caught leaning towards the same Thessian he'd been watching at the door, his head tilted just like the curious bird he had raised. The exorcist wondering if the no psychic's rule was a bit more flexible than he had originally thought. Perhaps this level of closeness was reserved just for her. The reaction was certainly different than the typical joking but sincere no Izime had offered every other time, Constantinople hoping his friend had finally found someone that interested him. "There's no reason for those two to be so close," Constantinople thought rather loudly, laughing as the psychic took another step back as the two were obviously caught on both ends. Those red eyes reading the same conclusions in the exorcist's mind, she pulled away from the cookie jar that had been caught whisper yelling into her ear. Constantinople looking over and catching Izime, who was trying to keep his smile from turning into a scowl. The psychic quickly following Izime down the stairs, either forgetting Constantinople's thoughts or choosing to ignore them.